So opening our discussion today will be Dr. Lee Edwards, Distinguished Fellow in Conservative Thought here at the Heritage Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edwards.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. We thank you so much for coming out today. You know, August is something of a slow month in Washington, D.C., and we're so pleased that we could attract some of this town's limited attention to the matter of U.S.-Taiwan relations. And I extend a warm welcome to our speakers, panelists, and of course to you, members of the audience. I particularly want to offer my appreciation to the Taiwan Benevolent Association of America and the Institute for Taiwan-American Relations for partnering with us on today's program. This is only the most recent in our series of similar events, which we've done with TBAA over the years. I know they've always been quite fruitful, and I expect today's conversation to be no less so. If I may, I'd like to say on a personal note that I first visited Taiwan in 1969, and there have been a few changes since then. There was no metro when I first visited there all of those days ago. And I've had the privilege of meeting and interviewing 3 Taiwan presidents, including the Honorable Lee Teng-hui. I'm among those Americans who will never forget the significant contributions of the Republic of China during World War II and then the Cold War. You know, it is indeed a very interesting time in U.S.-Taiwan relations. First, the governments. We have new ones. President Tsai Ing-wen took office last year, and her party took control of the legislative yuan. On the U.S. side, President Trump took office just this past January. And the presidential inaugurations in each of our countries represented a transfer in power between political parties. Whichever party we support in both our countries, whether we welcome the outcome or we're disappointed with it, we celebrate the institutions that allow this orderly transfer of power to take place. Now, transfer of power is not something that happens on the other side of the straits. There, the institutional framework is quite different. It's all tied up in the Chinese Communist Party. The faces may change, but the party never loses. Which brings me to the other rather interesting thing going on in U.S.-Taiwan relations, and that is China's behavior since Madam Tsai's election. Clearly, Beijing is intent on teaching the Taiwanese a lesson in who it chooses for its leaders. It's doubled down, squeezing Taiwan's international space, objecting to its participation in international organizations, siphoning away its diplomatic allies, and pressuring it economically. It's doing all this in the cause of getting Madam Tsai to accept a position on one China that is the antithesis of what she and her party stand for. Well, here at Heritage, we're not blue or green. But, we do believe that whatever the relationship between Taiwan and China, it must have the express support of the Taiwanese people. And at this point in history, they have elected Madame Tsai and the DPP and the views they represent on this question. Maybe future elections will change this, who knows? But until then, the position of our own new government should be to support Taiwan in the face of the coercion that it faces from Beijing. How do we do that? Well, I don't have to worry about coming up with the answers. We've assembled a fine group of experts to explore precisely this question, and we look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you all very much.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I would invite the members of the first session, Patrick Cronin, Zhongqian Tang, and Russell Xiao, and Professor Scott Kasner to join me up here on the stage. So each of the speakers will have about 12 minutes to provide their perspectives on cross-straits relations and the United States. We'll go in order on the agenda. So we'll begin with Patrick Cronin, Senior Director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. That will be then followed by Professor Zhongjian Deng of the National Tsinghua University in Taiwan, Russell Xiao, the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute, and then Professor Scott Kasner, Department of Government and Politics, University of Maryland. Patrick?
Well, Dean, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Heritage Foundation, which really has been a repository for U.S.-Taiwan relations for decades, as we just heard, I think, from our opening speaker quite eloquently. I also should add on a personal note that it was decades ago that I was learning quite a bit about Taiwan from Dean Cheng. As a young, very bright young man, who's still a very bright young man, but a little older, and doing great work. But he's the moderator, I'm the speaker, so I have to say something here about U.S.-Taiwan relations in the Trump administration and with the new administrations. I was at the White House yesterday. I can tell you that this administration is starting to come together, but it's still lagging behind, I think, what expectations would be and hopes would be for appointments of key people, but I think these are coming very shortly. And there's some very good people in the wings ready to go in. That'll be very familiar to people who watch U.S.-Taiwan relations. I think the basic point I would make here about the Trump administration's Taiwan policy is that the status quo is the current means, but it's not an end. And what I mean by that is that the cross-strait relationship is often cast in academia and also in the media as subject to potential major revision, and that this revision should be made in the form of some kind of fanciful grand bargain with China, or maybe just a small bargain, maybe a bad transactional deal. You know, as though you could pawn off Taiwan for the South China Sea or Korea. That's not how the Trump administration views the Taiwan policy, in my view. So I think for the Trump administration, they've been essentially testing and probing a bit from even before the inauguration, as you know, with tweets and telephone calls, to find out whether there could be a fairer bargain, a better bargain in this kind of negotiation over what is the status quo. And here, if I can just back up and try to understand the thinking really at the heart of the White House right now, it's not that the rules-based system is wrong. It's just that it's run its course for what it can do for the U.S. national interests and for U.S. allies and partners. And now other powers, and especially big growing powers like China, have learned to game that system and those rules. And they've done the same thing in terms of the cross-strait bargain in the 3 communiques and the 6 assurances. And as a result, there's a desire to figure out, can we regain a better deal for Taiwan so that it can have the voice that it should have over its future and have the autonomy and the space and the security to know that it's not going to be threatened with invasion or force or having to submit and succumb to coercion. And so that's what really this is about. This is about a negotiation that's going on here on the cross-strait bargain. So the early trial balloons, I think, from the Trump administration can be seen as good or bad and can be portrayed as grand bargains in the making and so on. But I think it's much more about testing out what is more to come from a eventual policy focused on a new end, an end of a freer and more prosperous Taiwan and Taiwanese people. That's really the objective here. But how to do that? And to do that right now, you have to be bound by the constraints of history and by previous administrations, and that's what the administration's starting with. It's starting with the cross-strait status quo, in effect, and hence Secretary of State Tillerson's reaffirmation of not just the Taiwan Relations Act, but also the One China policy and the 3 communiques and the 6 assurances. But the end, again, is a democratic, prosperous Taiwan, and this should be really the end goal from a bipartisan U.S. position. This isn't particularly a partisan position. It's a reaffirmation of our earlier American position in some ways, in trying to recognize that the ground has shifted and we need to figure out how to regain a better position. Now, President Tsai, just shifting gears from the Trump administration's view of this exciting new administration in Taipei, she's been an extraordinarily careful practitioner of statecraft. And yet, every time Dr. Tsai tries to come up with a new phraseology other than the 92 consensus and talk about a new type of interaction, the General Secretary of the Communist Party and his regime dismiss it. They don't want her to regain some new leverage and some new autonomy. They want to actually squeeze Taiwan further, whether it's stealing diplomatic recognition or cutting back tourism, which has been mostly made up by other countries by now, I understand, or finding other ways to put coercive pressure on Taiwan to change the rules and to write the rules unilaterally about the cross-strait relationship in Beijing. And this essentially is what is happening in the South China Sea in a more open way in terms of China trying to walk back the Permanent Court of Arbitration July 2016 judgment, which went vastly against China on the South China Sea, and China has ignored it and written their own rules. And if we let them, they will. And much the same on the cross-strait relationship. And I think the answer for the Trump administration, and I think for President Tsai, is no, we don't want to let them do that. So we have to find a reasonable way to find a better bargaining position. Dr. Tsai being very careful, President Trump being more audacious in terms of how he wants to try these trial balloons, but coming together underneath the Trump administration, a very professional group of Asian watchers who will go into place and try to figure out how to do my final big point here is how to essentially look for a status quo plus, the plus being a revision of this degradation of our leverage on the cross-strait negotiation, and therefore an increase in the autonomy and the prosperity and the security of Taiwan. So I think this is what we have seen with the arms sale. It was a very measured list of arms, but at the same time, it came at a very precarious time when the United States was negotiating at the summit level with between General Secretary Xi and President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. And I think the Trump administration wanted to be very clear that it was not bargaining away our interests in the region, whether it was in the South China Sea with freedom of navigation operations or across the strait with Taiwan, to try to win greater Chinese support for putting pressure on North Korea. And I don't want to digress and talk about North Korea. I think that's what everybody in the world is talking about this day, except for this group right here. So I want to stay focused on Taiwan. I will say there's one intersection in the near term between Taiwan and Korea that I worry about, and that is if you think about a potential deterioration of U.S. power projection in the first and even the second island chain toward Asia Pacific, the idea that 4 intermediate-range ballistic missiles could be launched in the vicinity of Guam, even in international waters off of Guam, is in some ways a stalking horse for Chinese anti-access and area denial capabilities. So the Chinese are privately applauding this, that is to see whether or not the United States could essentially be psychologically crippled and militarily weakened with respect to their power projection, our power projection capability, by hastening the day or the thought or the idea that somehow we will not be able to project power inside the first or second island chain, and that directly bears on the defense of Taiwan. So the security of Taiwan to be free from coercion and free from attack depends on power projection. It depends on economics. It depends on soft power. It depends on lots of things. But at the foundation is a strong defense. So it's very important, and I think this administration, the Trump administration, Secretary Mattis and the rest of the team will be very serious about following up on not just that arms sale, but cooperation. I think Dan Blumenthal and Randy Shriver, two people I would really watch closely on Taiwan policy in this administration, would have said it very well in terms of trying to make sure that we seek higher level engagement across the board with Taiwan as possible, as practical. But they said in a piece late last year after the election that history shows that when Taiwan feels isolated, it takes actions that destabilize the strait. And therefore, it's in the enlightened self-interest of the mainland to let Taiwan feel secure. And indeed, this is what the Chinese preach to us about North Korea. So I don't want to equate Taiwan and North Korea, but just to say that this is Chinese reasoning likes to flip back and forth between various different arguments when it suits their purpose. Well, the U.S.-Taiwan narrative here is clear. We're on the right side of history. And I think the arms sale, the engagement, the desire for a strong commitment, and we saw Secretary Mattis at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore talk about the commitment openly. So it's no longer a secret that we're openly committed to Taiwan. In fact, it's a very old story. And I think I'll stop there, and Dean, and wait for Q&A.
Thank you very much. Professor Deng.
Okay. I'm sorry. Was I supposed to?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to appreciate the invitation from Heritage Foundation, Taiwan Benevolent Association of America, Institute for Taiwan American Studies. My topic, of course, focus on Tsai Ing-wen's cross-strait policy. I'd like to jump to the declining popularity of Tsai Ing-wen. When he assumed office, after 1 month, there's a poor, public opinion poll, the popularity is 47. 100 days later, 39%. And 6 months later, 26%. 1 year later, that is this year, 28%. So we look at this declining popularity, that is a fact. Another, let's see those who support Taiwan independence or those who support status quo. And those who support independence immediately in last year, 15%. Those who support status quo now and independence later, 16%. Altogether, 31%. That's a much higher than Tsai Ing-wen's popularity. Of course, it's really not a proper comparison, but I'd like you to know what happened now in Taiwan. Why there's such kind of lack, the declining popularity? Of course, you see, Taiwanese, they have different kind of perspective. Why? They would like to see their lives, where their lives will be, okay? People talk about, but I remember one sayings, we just don't look at or listen your rhetoric. We have to observe your behavior. So that is very important. A lot of rhetoric support Taiwan, okay, but how? So let me back to the so-called international environment. Of course, the United States is the very important example. So let's see what happened in the international environment. That's a kind of uncertainty. You see, let's see Trump make America great again. Of course, that is what, economic nationalism. That is for sure. Relinquishment of multilateral and regional free trade agreement like TPP, renegotiation on the U.S. term, American term of bilateral free trade agreement, that is NAFTA. And also nowadays you see what happened in North Korea. We don't just put a lot of blame to everyone. We just would like to see the fact that is Trump administration must talk with China. Just like Trump would like to say something or talk with Russia with regard to Syria issues. So Taiwan's people, they are afraid of becoming a kind of card played by the great powers. For sure it is. Okay, so let's see the economic balance sheet of for Taiwan. For example, like Foxconn, you see Guo Taiming visit the White House the other day, promised aid in the first stage, $10 billion investment in U.S. And not long ago, Taiwan's delegation in the United States to attend Select USA Investment Summit pledged 34.1 billion investment. But how about Taiwan? Taiwan has, if Taiwan would like to survive or to maintain economic growth, then Taiwan needs to attract foreign direct investment. So this is a kind of international environment. Let's turn to domestic events. We are talking about democracy. What is democracy? In rhetoric, we can say a lot, but in political science, in these last 10 years, we put emphasis upon the participation of the mass, the participation of the people. That is very important. But if we look at the current administration, we all know what happened right now here in Taiwan. So I'd like to use the term called Taiwan's democracy under siege. Why? Because DPP, the ruling party, control everything. We know one thing, that is the pension system reform. But I would like to say that is selective reform. The reform doesn't touch upon political appointed high-ranking officials, not on judicial sector, only on middle level and lower level public employees like us, university professors. Okay. So that's kind of challenging. Someone just asked me, how much you under the reform? I say, in the end, 50% reduction, 50%. But they push for this reform just in 1 year. I remember in Europe, they all, in past in Europe, there's a kind of so-called reform, pension system reform. But in 10 years, how come you just push through 1 year? So let's use your majority. So last week also, last month, you can watch TV, you saw again fighting in the legislative yuan. Why? If you are a kind of ruling party, you'd like to use a kind of unity among the people, then you can sit down, talk about the so-called how to cooperate with that. I still remember one thing in 1980s. I studied here. I'm in Northwestern University in Chicago. I remember public policy. What is a kind of sound public policy? That is including the implementation. You have to consider implementation of the policy. Today is 2017, right? But why not in Taiwan? Why you heard me say a lot, you think you are blue. But I'm not blue, I'm a scholar. I just remind, if US, if any foreign friends, you have to look at what happened in Taiwan. If without a sound democracy, a really liberal democracy, then Taiwan cannot resist upon anything. So if you allow me to say, I just mentioned about the international environment, talking about domestic environment, then a sound grocery policy or a sound kind of policy or strategy should consider at least these two scenarios. Whether the United States can guarantee Taiwan's economic growth, guarantee Taiwan's economic development. If not, then we have to consider other things. A lot of people talking about a third scenario. That is the attraction or pressure, economic pressure from China. If you don't have anything, then what you will do? Begging? Begging whom? To whom you are going to beg? To whom you can find helps? So that is, I say, anything happen in Taiwan is really concerned with the people in Taiwan. People in Taiwan has this kind of feelings. So if the United States would like to support Taiwan, then they have to pay much attention to not just rhetoric, but also reality, behavior, whether this is a sound liberal democracy, whether this is a sound economic policy for Taiwan. Otherwise, just as everybody say, we need to get the approval of Taiwanese people to support something. Then people will use vote to support something or disapprove something. Okay, so I'm quite frankly speaking about the cross-strait policy. So I'd like you, all of you, to think about a sound policy in Taiwan or a sound cross-strait policy to consider these three scenarios together. One is the international environment, whether the United States is a kind of reliable ally. Second, whether Taiwan's democracy and economic development really reflect so-called liberal economy, liberal democracy. A third one, don't forget, the U.S. has a lot economic and trade relationship with China. You have to advise Taiwan's authorities, say, what kind of policy or economic trade policy with China, right? That is the only way to help the people in Taiwan. Suppose I have a PowerPoint file, but it doesn't show up. So I just like to use my presentation to let you know these very important three scenarios right now in Taiwan. And don't just look at the so-called rhetoric. You have to really look deep into what happened in Taiwan. Then you can really know whether it is your asset or liability. That's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dung. Russell Shao?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Dean, Walter Lohman, and also the Heritage Foundation for the invitation to speak here at today's timely event. Heritage is a special place for me because actually over a decade ago, I cut my teeth here as a young intern in the Asia Studies Center. And so for me, this is sort of a homecoming to be able to speak on this stage and with such a distinguished group of co-panelists. Allow me to preface my comments also by stating that the views expressed in my statement today are my own. I was asked to generally talk about cross-strait relations. The common refrain we often hear here in Washington is that cross-strait relations is at a standstill. However, this simplistic assertion neglects powerful undercurrents that are shaping relations in profound ways that will have an impact on how the two governments interact with one another going forward. Given the wealth of expertise that's already demonstrated on the stage today about U.S. policy towards Asia and Taiwan, as well as one perspective about domestic politics in Taiwan, I think my 10 to 12 minutes will be best spent focusing on specifics as to what has happened since 2016 in cross-strait relations, and to establish a baseline here of facts upon which we may have a discussion about the actual state of cross-strait affairs. To start, we must commence at the point where the current episode, if you will, begins. In January 2016, when Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party won landslide victories in the presidential and legislative elections. Despite a presidential campaign and legislative campaign that predominantly focused on domestic issues, and also President Tsai's pledge to maintain the status quo, the PRC quickly went on a diplomatic offensive to isolate the new government. In March, even before Tsai Ing-wen was sworn in, the PRC announced that it was resuming diplomatic relations with Gambia. Now, the small African country broke diplomatic ties with Taiwan in 2013. But for now obvious reasons, I think we all know that Beijing decided to hold off on establishing diplomatic relations for reasons that we know now. On May 20th, Tsai was inaugurated as the first female president of Taiwan. In her inauguration speech, President Tsai maintained her campaign pledge and highlighted her administration's long-awaited approach to cross-strait relations. That approach being based on three pillars. First, the ROC Constitution. 2, the act governing relations between the peoples of the Taiwan area and the mainland area. And 3, the historical fact of the 1992 meetings. Beijing basically shrugged off that speech and called it an incomplete test paper. Despite Tsai's olive branch, the PRC announced in June 2016 that it was suspending high-level government dialogues to channels of communications. Those high-level channels remain frozen to this day. In the absence of high-level communications between the two governments, the PRC's political warfare machinery went to work. For people who are interested in a deep dive of what was formerly known as the General Political Department of the PLA, I recommend everyone here in the audience to read a study that was authored by my former colleague, Mark Stokes, at the Project 2049 Institute in 2013. In September 2016, an organization with ties with the PLA, the China Energy Fund Committee, which describes itself as a high-end strategic think tank, hosted an international conference in Washington, D.C. entitled A War to Remember, United Chinese Efforts Against Japanese Invasion. The event largely flew beneath the radar screen of most Western analysts. Interestingly, it presented a keynote remark by Hou Wo-chun, whom I'm sure is no stranger to the people in this room, who had previously served as premier and also as chief of the general staff of the ROC Armed Forces. In the following month, in October, on a day meant to celebrate the events leading up to the establishment of the ROC government, Double 10, President Tsai issued her first major policy speech on cross-strait relations after becoming president. Most notably, President Tsai called on Beijing's leaders to face up to and I quote, to face up to the reality that the Republic of China exists, end quote, and that, quote, the two sides of the strait should sit down and talk as soon as possible. President Tsai also added that anything can be included for discussion as long as it's conducive to development of cross-strait peace and the welfare of the people of both sides. More broadly, in her speech, Tsai positioned cross-strait relations in the context of regional developments. This was ostensibly as an effort of the new administration to embed its China policy within a broader regional framework. While the CCP has always tried to co-opt friendly forces to support unification, its form of unification, through United Front work, these efforts went on overdrive after Tsai was elected president. In an unprecedented move in November of 2016, the PRC officially commemorated the birth and founder of the Nationalist Party and ROC, Sun Yat-sen. The official ceremony was attended by 6 of the 7 members of the powerful Politburo Standing Committee. The CCP leaders waxed lyrical about Sun's legacy and hoisted him up as a symbol of Chinese unity. In his speech, this General Secretary and PRC President Xi Jinping boldly proclaimed that CCP members are the most firmest supporters, most loyal collaborators, and the most faithful successors of Mr. Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary undertakings. He asserted that we, the CCP, would never allow anyone, any organization, any party to split off any tract or territory from China anytime or in any way. Stirring a great deal of controversy in Taiwan, the politically charged ceremony was reportedly attended by over 32 retired military officers from Taiwan. In the same month, the former KMT chairperson and the party's initial 2016 presidential candidate, Hong Shou-zu, led a delegation to the PRC to attend the annual KMT-CCP forum and met with Xi. It's likely that the incoming KMT chairperson, Wu Denyi, will meet with Xi later this year at this year's annual gathering. Then on December 2nd, 2016, President-elect Trump accepted a congratulatory phone call from the democratically elected leader of Taiwan. During the brief 10-minute phone exchange, President Tsai reportedly congratulated the president-elect on his election victory and exchanged views about the economy and other regional issues. Things got interesting afterwards. Of course, the PRC blamed the Tsai government for orchestrating the exchange between the two leaders, calling it a petty action that cannot change the one China structure already formed by the international community. Beijing lodged protests, solemn representations with Washington that reiterated the importance of the one China policy, urging the United States to cautiously, properly handle the Taiwan issue to avoid unnecessary disturbances in Sino-U.S. relations, despite nothing explicit in the U.S. one China policy that would prohibit such a phone call from ever taking place. Let me just point out the ridiculousness of the thought that a single 10-minute phone call between the President-elect Trump and President Tsai could ever even represent such a significant departure from U.S.-Taiwan relations, which remain firmly based upon the Taiwan Relations Act and the Six Assurances. On December 10th, Chinese military aircrafts from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command conducted exercises that encircled Taiwan. Compounding the pressure obviously meant to intimidate the Taiwanese people, the PRC has also resumed a full-court diplomatic press to squeeze Taiwan's international space, as Dr. Edwards had noted earlier. Beijing is not only stealing Taiwan's diplomatic allies, forcing non-diplomatic allies to downgrade their ties with Taipei, but is also preventing Taiwan's government from participating in international organizations, even where statehood is not a requirement. Indeed, the small African nation, Sao Tome and Principe, flipped on December 20th, 2016. Panama severed relations in just June of this year. Taiwan now has 20 diplomatic allies compared to more than 170 that recognizes the PRC. Beijing is forcing non-diplomatic allies like Taiwan to downgrade ties with Taipei. Nigeria is forcing Taipei to move its representative office from the capital. In Dubai, Ecuador, Bahrain, Jordan, UAE, Taiwan's trade offices were forced to remove any reference to the ROC or Taiwan in the name of their de facto embassies. Things heated up militarily at the beginning of this year when the PLA sailed its maiden aircraft carrier Liaoning and other work ships up the Taiwan Strait. Contrary to some reports, this was sailed west of the center line. In July 2017, the PLA sailed its aircraft carrier again through the Taiwan Strait a second time. But the most telling changes that could impact cross-strait relations after the election of President Tsai Ing-wen really came in February, in and after February of this year. The head of the Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences was replaced. The former director was a well-known Taiwan hand in the PRC's Taiwan policy community, and it was replaced by someone who was not a Taiwan expert and much more of an international affairs expert. Interestingly, this institute also is associated with the Chinese intelligence agency, the Ministry of State Security. And so I believe another interesting development happened when the senior statesman Dai Bingguo took over as chairman of the National Society of Taiwan Studies. This organization was stacked with government officials, belies its supposedly civilian status. The NSTS leadership structure consists of 4 deputy chairmen representing the CCP Central Committee's Taiwan's office, State Council's Taiwan's Affairs Office, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is a government-run research institution, and the Chinese Kuomintang Revolutionary Committee. Another interesting development that occurred in February is how, in yet another unprecedented fashion, the State Council Taiwan Affairs Office weighed in on Taiwan's 228 incident, which remains a politically sensitive episode in Taiwan's history, and referred to the mass protests that led to a bloody crackdown as, quote, a just action by Taiwanese against a dictatorship and a fight for their basic rights. A deeper analysis suggests that a statement may be intended to manipulate local sentiments about key political events in the nation's collective memory, a formative element in Taiwan's now distinct political identity. Indeed, in the most recent data set on identity in Taiwan produced by the Election Study Center at the National Tsinghua University, current as of June 2017, the percentage of people who identify only as Taiwanese represent a clear majority at 56%. This is up from 17.6% in 1992. Whereas people who identify as both being Taiwanese and Chinese is at 36.6%. This is down from 46.4% in 1992. And lastly, only Chinese at 3.8%, and this is down from 25.5% in 1992. In March, Taiwanese human rights activist Li Mingzhe was detained by Beijing's authorities and now has been detained for over 5 months. In May, more senior members from the PRC Taiwan policy apparatuses were changed and shuffled. And now there are rumors that there may be some additional shuffling coming up in the lead up to the 19th Party Congress. In May, also in the same month, President Tsai issued a statement highlighting these 3 news: situation, test, calling for a new model for cross-strait relations. Now, on top of all these political warfare types of activities, it's important to note that in July, when the famed Chinese human rights activist Liu Xiaobo passed away, President Tsai issued a very stirring eulogy. She said, and I want to quote this, "We hope that the Chinese authorities can show confidence in engaging in political reforms so that the Chinese can enjoy the God-given rights of freedom and democracy. This will be a turning point in cross-strait relations. The Chinese dream is not supposed to be about military might. It should be about taking ideas, like those from Liu Xiaobo, into consideration. Only through democracy, in which every Chinese person has freedom and respect, can China truly become a proud and independent country." To be sure, as my co-panelists have thoroughly noted, that President Tsai's approval rating has fallen from 69.9% when she first came into office to now being around 33%. I think while at face values this represents a significant drop, I think we have to take this in context of prior presidents' approval ratings also as well. For instance, President Ma, who also enjoyed a very, very high approval rating when he came into office, but for the 2 terms, actually, his approval rating hovered between a low 20% and the high 30s. And so I think if we put that into context, this is probably a pretty normal ebb and flow in terms of how democratic politics works in Taiwan. So let me conclude with just 3 quick observations. Despite observers' comments that the PRC has a wait-and-see mode to observe Taiwan's government, Tsai government, I think it's increasingly clear that its action, that Beijing has already made up its mind and is unwilling to work with the new government. Tsai has been restrained, flexible, as well as creative in its approach to the PRC. However, I think her low approval rating can impact her ability to maintain a steady ship. That said, it should be noted that her low approval rating probably has less to do with her handling of cross-strait relations and more about her ambitious domestic reform agenda. I think thirdly and most importantly, the onus is really on Beijing to resume high-level communications with Taipei. With that, I will close.
Thank you very much. Professor Kasman?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation for inviting me here today. This is actually my first time at Heritage. So I was asked to say a few words about prospects for stability in the Taiwan Strait. I'll start out by noting that my comments here are in essence kind of an effort to try to abstract away from day-to-day events in cross-strait relations and to focus instead on what I see as some of the broader trends in the relationship and some of the broad incentives that face the PRC. Which is a nice way of saying that in contrast to Mr. Xiao's presentation, which was very concrete, mine is going to amount to speculation, and so take what I say with a grain of salt. Okay, so obviously cross-strait relations have been quite tense over the past year and a half since Tsai Ing-wen was elected president of Taiwan, and this contrasts quite markedly to the 8 years of relative détente that we saw during the administration of Ma Ying-jeou. But I'm going to argue that the Taiwan Strait remains reasonably stable and that the risks of armed conflict, at least in the near term, remain relatively low. I'll note in closing, however, that the longer-term trends are potentially more troubling. Okay, so let me try to explain why I believe that the Taiwan Strait remains relatively stable despite the uptick in tensions that we've seen over the past year and a half. Sorry. Just accidentally forwarded to the end of my presentation. Okay, so let me try to explain why I think that the Taiwan Strait remains relatively stable. So to put it in simplistic terms, and setting aside scenarios like accidents in the Taiwan Strait that could potentially lead to rapid escalation, I think there are at least three broad rationales that could underpin a decision by PRC leaders to consider a more militarily coercive approach to Taiwan. And my sense is that all three of these scenarios are relatively unlikely. Okay, so the first rationale, and what I think is the most straightforward scenario, is one where Chinese leaders essentially come to believe that coercion would be an effective way to generate more accommodating policies in Taiwan. That is, to push Taiwan in the direction of unification at relatively little cost. In an extreme case, PRC leaders might come to believe that they could accomplish unification with Taiwan using military means at acceptable cost. A second scenario is one where PRC leaders recognize that military coercion would be both costly and potentially quite risky, but they might nevertheless come to believe that current trends in the Taiwan Strait are such that are so unfavorable that they feel compelled to act despite these high costs and risks. In other words, Chinese leaders could come to believe that on the Taiwan issue, time is not on Beijing's side, and there's a need to act sooner rather than later. Finally, Chinese leaders may come to view coercion in the Taiwan Strait as useful for domestic political reasons. For instance, if growth were to slow on the mainland or if an economic crisis were to erupt in China, there could be a sense in Beijing that a crisis in the Taiwan Strait could potentially help to divert people's attention away from these problems and to help generate instead a rally around the flag effect that would bolster popular support for the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so let me say a few words about each of these scenarios and why I think that each is relatively unlikely in the near term. To begin with the worst case scenario, I think it's very unlikely that PRC leaders would view the initiation of a major military operation against Taiwan to achieve unification as anything other than incredibly risky and potentially very costly. There are many ways that a war in the Taiwan Strait could go horribly awry for China, including but not limited to possible escalation escalation to a possible war with the U.S., the triggering of a severe economic crisis in China, and the possibility of a humiliating defeat. Given these risks, I think that this scenario remains highly unlikely unless Beijing were to feel backed into a corner, and that's a possibility I'll come back to in a minute. A more likely scenario is one where Beijing adopts a more militarily coercive approach short of war. For instance, using more explicit military threats or provocative exercises to try to push Taiwan to adopt more accommodating policies toward China, such as relating to the One China principle. Yet even a shift to a more militarily coercive approach short of war carries with it significant risks for Beijing, given what I think is widely seen as a pragmatic approach to cross-strait relations that's been adopted by the Tsai administration in Taiwan. So it's generally recognized that it's easier to make coercive threats to deter changes to a status quo than it is to use coercive threats to try to compel changes to a status quo. And I think that there's a general sense that PRC coercion was quite useful during the 1990s and 2000s when the PRC was trying to deter what it saw as steps toward independence by the Lee Teng-hui and Chen Shui-bian administration. So PRC coercive diplomacy at that time, such as the 1996 missile tests, signaled to Taiwan that the island risked losing a lot in pursuit of what were largely symbolic sovereignty-related gains. Okay, but this type of coercive diplomacy doesn't seem as necessary today, given that Tsai's government, at least from my vantage point, has been quite conservative in its approach to cross-strait relations and has refrained from actively challenging the status quo in a way that we saw during the Chen Shui-bian administration. Assuming that this relatively conservative approach to cross-strait relations continues in Taipei, and I think that's quite likely, then a shift toward a more coercive approach in Beijing would represent an effort to compel Taiwan to be more accommodating than it has been. Yeah, it's hard for me to see how this would work out well for Beijing. Coercive military threats would have the potential to back Tsai Ing-wen into a corner, where it could be potentially quite damaging to her politically should she back down. And whereas the US was quite critical of Taiwan during the Chen Shui-bian administration, when Washington viewed Taiwan as a troublemaker that was pursuing destabilizing policies, I think the US would be much more sympathetic to Taiwan in this scenario where the PRC appears to be trying to compel changes to the status quo rather than deterring changes. More generally, I think it's worth emphasizing that a military showdown in the Taiwan Strait, even short of war, would cause a great deal of unease in the region. And if Beijing were seen as the party initiating the crisis, it would undercut confidence in China at precisely a time when it seems to me that China has a great opportunity to portray itself to countries in East Asia as a responsible power, as a source of stability and calm. Okay, so in short, I suspect that PRC leaders likely view military options in the Taiwan Strait as risky and potentially counterproductive. And so I think it's unlikely that they view military coercion as an attractive option for making progress on the issue of Taiwan status, at least in the near term. Okay, in a second scenario where PRC leaders might initiate military coercion in the Taiwan Strait, Chinese leaders pursue such an approach despite recognizing the high costs and risks involved. Here they fear that trends in the Taiwan Strait are unfavorable, and that absent efforts to arrest those trends, the island might essentially be lost forever. In other words, PRC leaders act in this scenario not to accomplish new gains on the Taiwan issue, as in the first scenario, but rather to arrest what they see as future losses. Okay, so if, for example, leaders in Beijing believe that trends in Taiwan identity, such as those that Mr. Xiao just pointed out, and domestic politics in Taiwan, mean that the island is moving ineluctably toward Taiwan independence, and that it would be better to deal with this problem now rather than allow Taiwan-centric identity to continue to solidify on the island, then PRC leaders could conceivably conclude that it would be better to act sooner rather than later and initiate conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So Chinese leaders, in short, might come to believe that time is not on China's side. Clearly, Beijing does have reason to be worried about some trends in the Taiwan Strait. Extensive economic integration across the Taiwan Strait, for instance, has not appeared to have the effects on Taiwan identity and voting patterns in Taiwan that some in China had hoped for. Yet I also think that China has some pretty good reasons to believe that, over the long haul, time is still on Beijing's side. Most obviously, China's economic and military power continue to grow, even as US global leadership is looking ever more tenuous. Within Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen's popularity, as has been noted already, is declining, and her party faces the inevitable challenges associated with governing. And Beijing has been quite adept at keeping Taiwan in what Shelley Rigger has referred to as its international birdcage, where Taiwan's international space seems to be ever shrinking. Okay, so it seems to me that Beijing can still afford to be patient on the Taiwan issue, confident that long-term trends continue to favor the PRC. Finally, a third reason Beijing might want to pursue a more coercive policy would be to generate some sort of diversionary effect, which might become a salient possibility, for instance, if the economy were to go off the rails in China. Yet here again, I think it's worth emphasizing that the pursuit of a diversionary policy in the face of domestic difficulties would be quite risky and potentially counterproductive. I don't want to completely dismiss the possibility of diversionary conflict, but I think it's important to recognize that a serious military crisis in the Taiwan Strait would almost certainly magnify the many changes faced by the PRC leadership. And as such, I suspect that this course of action would only be contemplated if things were already quite dire in China. Okay, so I'll finish with the obvious caveat here that I don't know what goes on in Xi Jinping's head, and I suspect that others on this panel probably have a better understanding in that regard than I do. Okay, but when I look at the myriad challenges that China faces today and the fundamental intractability of the cross-strait sovereignty dispute, I think that there's some pretty good reasons for wanting to kick the can down the road if that can be done in a reasonably graceful way with Tsai Ing-wen in power. This doesn't mean that the Taiwan Strait isn't still a dangerous place, and it doesn't mean that the relationship won't remain tense and that the PRC won't continue to try to squeeze Taiwan internationally. But I also think that there are some pretty strong incentives for the PRC to act with restraint as long as Tsai's government appears to be doing the same. And I'll just go ahead and conclude by saying that I do worry more about some of the longer-term trends in the Taiwan Strait and the prospects for stability that these trends portend. I suspect that support for unification will continue to remain negligible in Taiwan, given political trends in China, meaning that the underlying sovereignty dispute is likely to persist for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, as the military balance of power continues to shift in China's favor, particularly if the U.S. becomes less engaged in the region down the road, I worry that in the future, China may come to become more confident that it can resolve the Taiwan issue once and for all at acceptable cost. Okay, so while I'm relatively optimistic about the prospects for short-term stability in the Taiwan Strait, I worry more about long-term trends. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We now open up the floor to questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Right here. Please wait for the microphone, and if you could please identify yourself.
Hi, thank you, Dean. Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times. I have two questions. First one for Patrick. You just mentioned there's some good people going to work for Trump. Wonder, do you want to share who are those people and what kind of position they will get into Trump's? And the second question is, if there were a military crisis in Korean Peninsula, do you think Taiwan has any role to play? We notice more people in Washington calling for expansion of a military tie with Taiwan, even port call between U.S. and Taiwan. Wonder, Dean or Patrick, would you like to comment? Because I remember when Taiwan Security Enhancement Act was introduced many years ago, you know, the executive branch opposed this idea. But when you look at the content, actually a lot of them has become reality. So what is pushing behind, you know, all this trend and development? Thank you.
Yes, I wish I could say something about political appointments, but I really would direct that toward the administration. I did mention a couple of good people to keep an eye on, however, so I would look at that. The question of Taiwan's role in a scenario, security scenario in North Korea or in the region is a very interesting one. And you mentioned the idea of port visits was very provocative. Of course, China not happy to hear something like a port visit to Taiwan. There hasn't been a port visit for many decades, so it would be unprecedented. So one of the ideas from, I think, the administration's camp would be to talk about Taiwan exercise in Guam. Now, this directly relates to the current crisis, not intentionally. But because North Korea seems to be targeted on U.S. territory in the Pacific. If Taiwan were to take part in a variety of security assistance operations exercises with Japan, the United States, with other partners, to build capacity, they could well be exercising something that could involve a North Korean missile attack. After all, North Korea's missiles are of unknown reliability. Who knows where these things could land? I don't think Kim Jong-un knows. So as a result, I think it would be very prudent for Taiwan to be integrated a little more into regional safety, public safety, in domain awareness and emergency response.
Other members of the panel?
I mean, I think I would just add that, on the notion of domain awareness, integration of Taiwan into the regional ISR architecture is, critical. Taiwan has one of the most advanced ISR capabilities, I think, along the East Asia, and being able to utilize that within, and both, in particular, in a more passive, sort of environment, it would be, I think, very conducive to maintaining regional security. On the more sort of kinetic side of things, I defer to Patrick's and Dean's assessments on those issues.
Dean, you should speak up.
No, I'm serving as moderator here. That would be unfair. So,
Okay.
other questions in the back?
Hi, my name is Garrett Van der Wees. I'm former editor of Taiwan Communique. Thank you very much for excellent presentations. I had a comment and a question. The comment is on the perceived dropping approval rating of President Tsai Ing-wen. I just came back from Taiwan of 3 months of research there, and the sense I got was that many of her supporters feel she is not moving fast enough and far enough in terms of her reforms, particularly pension reform, judicial reform, and so on. It doesn't have anything to do with cross-strait relations, where she does maintain very, very solid support. So I think that's an important point there. The question was for Patrick. Good to see you again. And in your presentation, you did say, or you did have a rather positive image of the Trump administration in terms of its ultimate goal for Taiwan. Could you elaborate a little bit on the status quo currently means what it is, but it's not an end for the administration? I think that's a rather intriguing point, and if you could elaborate on that point a bit, that would be appreciated.
Well, thank you. Sure, and not to restate what I've already said, but to think through the probes that President-elect Trump made, and then I think early Trump administration and the president himself made with respect to talking about the one China policy and then backing off of it, and then seeing a full-throated reaffirmation of the one China policy and all that followed from Secretary Tillerson and other officials. I think that was a reversion back to the status quo for the moment, but not the end of the story. And I think the administration is waiting to have a full complement of the people who need to be in place at the Defense Department, at the State Department, not just the National Security Council, and at the White House, so that they can work on an integrated strategy on these issues. And I think this is coming. And the reason I'm sounding more optimistic is partly to be a counterweight to the excessive pessimism that is kind of an overhang from the election, and is also driven, yes, in part by the president's own maybe lack of a sort of predictable statecraft that we are often accustomed to see from politicians. It's unorthodox, yes. I think he would admit that. So I'm actually optimistic. So when I talk to people I know who are going into this administration who are really expert on this issue, I'm just very, very heartened and impressed that they will have a big voice on shaping an intelligent, muscular, assertive, broad-ranging, forward-looking posture of higher-level engagement and support for Taiwan, but within, this is important, within the pragmatic bounds of understanding that we're operating still from a status quo, but one that's been increasingly unfavorable, whether it's the military balance across the strait or the isolation strategy that Beijing is practicing. It's not just a wait and see, it's a wait and see plus, or minus, to try to chip away at Taiwan. Well, we want to turn that in the other direction, and I think the administration wants to do that. I think the details remain to be worked out. So, but the people going in who are going to be doing this know what they're doing.
That gentleman mentioned something about what I'm just talking about. I'd like to make a reply. My focus, just my presentation, my focus on that. That is kind of damage of Taiwan's liberal democracy. That is very important. If you shift through newspapers, in Chinese, and you can see the uproar along all these, public employees. If this is a sound liberal democracy, of course, you can use other ways, not create a lot of so-called social cleavage there. So that's that kind of way to handle the country. So I just give a warning signal, and we have to pay attention to the democracy. What kind of democracy we are pursuing for? And then we investing into it to know more about it. Without sound democracy, of course, indirectly it will affect cross-strait policy in the end. Okay, that's my point. Thank you very much.
Other questions? Gentlemen? Yep.
Thank you very much for that wonderful speech. I have a question for Scott and Russell. Do you agree, or would you please comment that on remark from Stephen Yates talking about Taiwan do not expect the United States would intervene if people all agree to take independence action, since it's Taiwan's own choice? And do you think this is even this is not an official statement from the states, but will you treat it as an opportunity, or that will be the threat, as a signal for the Tsai's administration and its Taiwan independent advocates? And other questions I would like to address to Dr. Dan and Patrick. Dr. Dan has mentioned about the Taiwan's democracy, that Taiwan shares the common value with the United States, especially the democracy. But we also noticed the numerous social media accounts in Taiwan has been suspended for the crime of criticizing Tsai Ing-wen's government. And also, the news media in Taiwan tends to be more conservative and self-regulate in order to avoid rejections of license renewal. So they are kind of hesitate to report protest or any kind of anti-government related events, including the Anti-Retirement Reform Act. So would you please comment if this is a signal that Tsai's administration is moving towards one-party dominance, since the silence of opposition voice has begun to sink in Taiwan? Thank you.
May now start off and then maybe. Okay, sure. I think as to Mr. Yates' comments, I think I think his comments, his statement is rather consistent with what has been longstanding U.S. policy, which is that it does not support any unilateral changes to the status quo, and I think I'll just leave it at that in response to comments on Mr. Yates' comments. As far as anti-government protest, I mean, I don't know. From the medias that I've been seeing in Taiwan, there seem to be a lot of protests, and so I don't know if there's any shortages in terms of coverage about anti-pension reform protests that are happening, or indigenous rights protests that are happening. And so I think it does. I think the media environment is still very vibrant and still a very lively media environment. And I think that's reflective of the democracy that is that exists in Taiwan. So perhaps I don't share the same vantage point in terms of your perspective as to the sort of constrained media environment in Taiwan. I tend to think that it's actually a very perhaps even too vibrant media environment in Taiwan. So.
I'll go ahead and second the point about the Yates comment. I guess I would be surprised if, especially given kind of the very public criticism of Taiwan during the Chen Shui-bian administration that you saw coming from the United States, I guess I would be surprised if people thought that there was kind of an unconditional U.S. commitment to Taiwan's security, regardless of what Taiwan does.
Okay. Yes, it is widely reported that some printed matters and the TV news coverage is just have quite limited coverage about the anti-establishment, I should say, establishment demonstration. It is true, but fortunately, the social media play a very major role. Daily, you can receive a bunch of information about this. But I'd like to say, when I'm talking about democracy, democracy is not a regular election, not just a peaceful transfer of power, not just free press. I think people pay much attention to not just political human security, but also economic and social human security. So that is that matters. I'm talking about the opinion poll. It's a kind of measurement of a total picture about people to Tsai Ing-wen, because the question just focuses on whether you approve or disapprove. So that's a general concept about what is her policy, her strategy, and her policy, not just individually talking about what kind of policy. So remember, what is opinion poll? I'm just indicating this is a measurement not for Ma Ying-jeou, for Tsai Ing-wen. So she must be quite aware this kind of trend. And again, as I mentioned, what is democracy? Not just election, not just peaceful transfer of power, not just a lot of things. We should pay all of this, not just one of these or two of this. That's my point. Thank you.
Dean, if I may, I'm sorry, go ahead, Patrick, go ahead.
I was just going to throw in a very quick thought on democracy. The trends right now in the world are favoring not so much top-down power, but bottom-up. And in Hong Kong, you worry about, what that means, and they worry about it as well. I just had a friend in my office this morning from Shanghai and explained to me how he had to put together new paperwork to revalidate a program, an academic program, through the propaganda department of the Communist Party of China. And can you imagine, I don't think most Americans could imagine having to try to do this. And it's congruent with U.S. values to support those who want that kind of freedom from that kind of oppressive government. So yeah, we can argue about different kinds of democracy, but we know about autocracy, and we know what we don't want, and I think Taiwan's speaking pretty clearly. I've got a lot of great friends in the KMT, and I have great respect for the fact that we can go from one party to the next in Taiwan, just as we can with allies in Japan and Korea and around the world. And our friends put up with our messy democracy in the United States when we go from one party to another. And we like that messy bottom-up process more than being told from top down exactly how to organize everything we do in our lives.
Just a quick point, and this kind of follows Patrick's comments, which I agree wholeheartedly. And that is on the issue of the media environment, though, there is one element that I am a little concerned about, and that is disinformation campaigns perpetuated by the PRC. And I think this is a vulnerability in all democracies or more sort of free media environments where, investments as well as, subversive media campaigns can infiltrate the media environment and spreading false news. And this is a vulnerability that's not only unique to Taiwan, but also in the United States as well. And I think that there is actually a great deal of cooperation that can be done in terms of learning about how to sort of counter disinformation campaigns between the United States and Taiwan and dealing with especially those emanating from the PRC.
And Michael Cole just published a piece on this very issue, right?
Yeah.
Which would be worth looking at.
Other questions? This gentleman here. Again, please identify yourself and your institution.
Yes, I'm Russell King. I'll direct this question to either Mr. Dong or Mr. Shao. One, I believe Taiwan's only diplomatic ally in Europe may be Vatican City, and I believe Pope Francis is trying to improve relations with Beijing concerning appointment of bishops. And there's also a patriotic Catholic church in China, which is really a fake church that China has. But there's one statement in Divini Redemptoris written by Pope Pius XI in the 30s. He says, communism is intrinsically wrong, and no one who would save Christian civilization may collaborate with it in any undertaking whatsoever. Do you consider full diplomatic relations with Beijing to be an undertaking whatsoever, or even going to the Beijing Olympics? That seems to be an undertaking whatsoever. Is the Vatican wavering in their relationship with Taiwan, or how are they working right now?
Maybe you want to take that question.
Thank you. Right now, of course, Vatican just maintain official or diplomatic relationship with Taiwan only. So there's one key difference between China and the Vatican, that is how to order the bishop and the archbishop. So that's the kind of question. But I don't see in the near future both sides will work out a kind of solution. So I don't see less changes about the relationship between Vatican and Taiwan. Yes.
I agree with Dr. Den on that one.
Other questions?
My name is Charles Koo from Dallas, Texas. I am really interested in what Director Xiao, just expressed. So I'd really like to know a little bit your background and what is this Global Taiwan Institute? I'm really. Can you tell us just a little bit?
Sure, I'm happy to plug my organization here. Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Gu. The Global Taiwan Institute is a new think tank that was established in September of 2016. We have an office near DuPont Circle. Our mission is to enhance U.S.-Taiwan relations through policy research and through public education. We have a number of programs that include a weekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we send out electronically to all our subscribers, which we have about over 1,000 now. It's to address current developments related to Taiwan and contextualize them in the broader policy discussions here in the United States. We have a biweekly seminar series where we try to raise the visibility of Taiwan in the broader policy discussions here in Washington. So we just held an event on public diplomacy between the United States and Taiwan, where we had a State Department official from the director of the Public Diplomacy Bureau at the State Department, Lisa Heller, attend. And so we made our debut actually on the State Department's EAP Bureau's website, so we're a Twitter account, so we're pretty happy about that. We have our annual symposium that's coming up next month, so stay tuned for announcements about that. And we have fellowships programs to promote scholarly exchanges between the United States and Taiwan. So thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any question in the back?
Hi, Paul Huang from the Epoch Times. I have a question for Professor Kastner. In your remark, you concluded by saying that in the short term, Taiwan, specifically Tsai administration, can probably maintain the status quo, but in the longer term, that China will be more and more likely to be able to afford to do something. That I guess the implication is, as China's military and economy grow stronger and stronger, they are more likely to afford the price of doing something to Taiwan. But that seems to underscore the problem with the short-term strategies by the Tsai administration, because if that seems to indicate that in the longer term, Taiwan will be at a disadvantage, that the conservative strategy that you mentioned Tsai administration has adopted will probably not work out in the longer term. What do you think that Taiwan should do then in the longer term? Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, I think that Taiwan's long-term situation is pretty tenuous, but that doesn't mean that I think pursuing a less conservative approach is likely to pay off in the short term. I think it's more likely to trigger a considerable amount of instability in the Taiwan Strait. So, I mean, my personal view is that Taiwan's best course of action is to try to maintain the status quo as long as it can, and kind of hope that that the U.S. stays engaged in the region. And that kind of China continues to have a significant stake in stability in the region. So I guess I don't think that the long-term situation is hopeless for Taiwan, but I think it's a situation that requires a lot of careful management, both by Taiwan and by the United States, and kind of careful, sober policies. So I don't think a return to kind of the sort of policies that you saw, for example, under Chen Shui-bian would be in Taiwan's interest at all.
Any other responses?
Thank you. John San with CTI TV of Taiwan. This is a follow-up to a question to Patrick, actually, earlier. Patrick, when you say you are optimistic about the status quo plus, because a number of Taiwan experts will be soon going into the government, do you detect any willingness on the top leadership right now at the White House, at the state, at the Pentagon, that share that kind of willingness? Thank you.
Yes. Well, without talking about things I can't discuss, when I express optimism, I believe it's coming from the top. I believe the political will is from the top. There's a big agenda. There's a lot to be done. There's obviously too little time and too few hours in the day and too few people appointed so far. But at the same time, I can see what is in the works, and I'm impressed, positively impressed. And I think there should be bipartisan support even for this kind of approach. And I think there will be a concerted effort to work with Congress on both sides of the aisle to try to build further support. But I think all things in their time, and we're not quite ready to go back to some of these issues just yet. There are a few priorities up there for the United States government. And I think you would understand that some things are pressing right now. So wait till the late fall when these people are in place, and I think they will be articulating much better than I've done today the administration's approach to Taiwan, and I think it'll be a compelling one.
Question in the front.
Thank you. My name is Charles Chan. I grew up in Taiwan and I lived in America for many, many years. I, of course, very concerned about the situation in Taiwan. I believe firmly that the well-being of Taiwan and the people live in Taiwan is in the hands of people in Taiwan. For example, we witnessed the growth of Taiwan over the last 40 years. And Taiwan had its glory days as one of the four dragons. And lately, we kind of lost. We lost somewhere. And I think the well-being of Taiwan and people in Taiwan are firmly in the hands of the people in Taiwan. However, the long-term destiny of Taiwan is out of their control. They have no influence of the outcome of what will happen in Taiwan ultimately. It really comes down to what's happening between China and America. And whomever become more influential and will get their way. Taiwan has been very fortunate that allied with America in the last 70 years since World War II. That was because America had upper hand. And the tide is changing. We all witnessed this. So how that change and will eventually, in my view, influence or decide the destiny of Taiwan. I would like to ask the panelists to share your comment about this. And I think the outcome of South China Sea will be the same. The South China Sea, China wants the natural resources under the sea. Okay, they don't worry about the freedom of passage. And who's going to win? China or America? It all depends on who has the upper hand. And it all boils down to international relations is who has the upper hand and who has the say. So in a way, I'm wondering, okay, that what we discussed today and all the discussion had so many times in different occasions, it will not bear any consequence to the ultimate outcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone on the panel want to tackle that?
Perhaps I'll just say that I respectfully do not share your pessimism with regards to the future being, sort of the destiny being outside the hand of the Taiwanese people. I think that does nevertheless highlight the need to build consensus within Taiwan, and that, if Taiwan can successfully build consensus, then I think that destiny is firmly within the grasp of the Taiwanese people to be able to present, if I may say, a united front, in order to deter and resist Chinese coercion, political, economic, and military. And so I would say that, there has been, in my perspective, in my opinion, promising signs of that consensus emerging, particularly amongst younger generations of people, younger people in Taiwan. And I think particularly where identification is not so much based upon, identity is not so much based upon your ethnicity, but more on sort of civic identity. And I think that is a strength for building a sort of greater unity among the people. And so I think, to me, that is a sign for growing resiliency among the population. And I think that would help in being able to contribute to a greater say in what will happen in the future of the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, I specialize at the international political economy, so I still remember so-called East Asian model. In the past, that's a theory called flying goose or flying geese theory. So in the 1960s, 1970s, even entered into the 1980s, Japan is the leading goose. But how about today's East Asia? The answer is quite clear. So how can you forget or not follow the leading goose? So that's a kind of question we have to investigate into it to know whether Taiwan can be a so-called four dragon or four little tiger again. Then that's we have to seek the answer from it. Because I don't have PowerPoint, I'm just showing. Nowadays, the Belt Road Initiative, the AIIB, and a lot of people accuse, say, AIIB is the Chinese model. But do you know that nowadays, AIIB joined with the ADB, Asian Development Bank, to make a loan for several projects, not just one, several projects. So who knows the future, what will happen in the future. But if one day China replaces the United States as the leading or hegemonic power, maybe it also follow the navigation freedom formula as the United States. But who knows? Big power, great power, always, establish its own rule. History tells us. Okay.
I'd just like to add an extra point to what was being said, and to the point about having, being shaped by great powers and not being able to sort of chart its own path. I would just point out that the current government, Taiwan's government, has initiated something called the New Southbound Policy, which I think is a proactive policy that is trying to engage with South Asia and Southeast Asian countries to access, develop greater people-to-people connection as well as the economy amongst in that region, and in that way is an attempt, I think, to try to chart its own path in terms of carving out a new future for Taiwan. Whether that will be successful, I think, remains to be seen. But some preliminary numbers in terms of tourism from the people from the region going to Taiwan, which has increased, as well as building, sort of having there being a strong foundation of different types of MOUs and understandings that can help pave the way for for more agreements to be signed to help economic interaction, I think, could potentially be a way to offset this sort of great power imbalance that, that you observed Taiwan seems to be trapped in.
Can I have 3 brief responses? First, don't underestimate Taiwan's influence, or human agency for that matter. It's not trivial, but I understand it's not the cross-strait balance, it's the global balance that is the bigger issue. And there, my second point would be, let's not make some linear extrapolation about China. In this year of the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping has added every title known to mankind, and he still does not control China, this empire that he's trying to wrest control over. So we'll see about the internal contradictions within China in the future. And then thirdly, it's really an admonition for the administration for the United States to start to get very serious about the competition we are in. And I think this administration understands that at the very highest level, and it's trying to do something about it. But because we're not Kim Jong-un and we control everything inside, you got to work in a messy democracy to try to mobilize reform and improvement and revision. And I think working with friends like Taiwan will be paramount importance in succeeding.
And can I just say a few words as well? I mean, I don't think that type of fatalism is really in Taiwan's interest, to be honest. I think that a lot of Taiwan's future is really in Taiwan's hands. I'm not a military expert, but just reading the writings of people like Bill Murray at the Naval War College, I mean, my sense is that there's a lot that Taiwan can do to enhance its deterrent capabilities. I think that Taiwan's economic future in large part depends on what sorts of choices are made by Taipei. And I think that the degree to which Taiwan is able to maintain support in the United States is largely a function of the sorts of policies that you see coming from Taiwan and what sort of democracy Taiwan is. So I think that there's a lot about Taiwan's future that's in Taiwan's hands.
Sure.
Scott, I agree with you. I think the future of Taiwan, the well-being of the Taiwan still is in the hands of people in Taiwan. However, we all know there is a red line. Don't cross it. If you cross that, there's everything goes. So if Taiwan moves toward independence, declare independence, separate from China, that's the end of it. So that's today. That's today, okay? 10 years from now, it could be different, but I think the well-being of today, tomorrow, next year are in the control of Taiwan, people in Taiwan.
Thank you, sir.
But the ultimate destiny, I'm afraid it's outside, out of Taiwan's control.
Thank you. Time for one last question? Gentleman on the right.
Hi, I'm Claude, a undergraduate student at the George Washington University, and this actually very much concerns current events. And so this concerns the fact that Taiwan actually trades with North Korea. And so if any of you could comment on how that would affect power dynamics in the region should the U.S. decide to step up its involvement, let's say, port visits to Taiwan in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know, actually. No? Anyone want to take this? What?
Why don't you take that, Dean?
Well, that's certainly an interesting proposition, so.
Okay, okay, all right. But I know, I think, just recently, President Tsai had issued a statement at a international conference held in Taipei on and it was held regarding Asia-Pacific security issues, and North Korea was raised, and she had, I believe, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Taiwan stands to play a proactive role in the region to contribute to regional stability, and ostensibly that would include issues related to curbing illicit trade between Taiwan and North Korea. And I'm aware of reports by reporters that have indicated about sort of these types of trade that's ongoing between Taiwan and North Korea. I believe that there are efforts underway by the government, both in this administration and previous administrations, to try to curb that trade. Taiwan can, I think, play with sort of its position between the East China Sea and South China Sea, is well positioned to be to play a more active role in making sure that illicit materials that Pyongyang is transferring, between the waterways of in East China Sea and South China Sea to be able to seize those. And so I think that is a matter for further deliberation, and so hopefully that there will be more efforts to try to integrate Taiwan into these efforts.
And let me just build on Russell's point. It's not Taiwan, it's throughout Asia. It's Africa. There are a lot of countries. North Korea has found the building of an illicit economy is a good countermeasure to pressure and sanction. And some of our closest friends in Southeast Asia have been also conduits for trade with North Korea. Now that we're able to marshal more information and focus more on this illicit network, we can go to our friends in Taiwan and our other friends, and we can together work on putting pressure on these assets in this trade. And so this is now another instance where Taiwan is part of the solution for regional and global security.
Well, thank you all, for all four members of this panel, for a very, very enlightening and interesting discussion, and for a very interesting set of diverse perspectives. Please join me in thanking.
Can we get started?
Yes, please, Dr. Shum.
I just flew in from Taipei last night. And I have to say, the first thing I appreciate, I have to say, very strong appreciation for is your nice and cool weather. Taipei is so hot, and as you know, all the government agencies had to shut down the air conditioning between 1 to 3 in the afternoon for almost whole week. So I appreciate, among other things, the first thing is your nice and cool weather. So good to see so many old friends. I have to tell you that I think I started to owe a talk of U.S.-Taiwan relations to Heritage ever since I came here as ambassador in 2014. But today I came back to pay my debt. And also I thank the co-sponsors, the TBAA and the ITAS. I'm so happy to see so many old friends. And I've been retired for 14 months already. And, but I stay very busy. I remain a very close observer and a frequent contributor to some major newspapers in Taipei about the foreign affairs, writing a lot of foreign affairs or cross-strait relations columns or articles. I think I appreciate some newspapers, always been very nice to me. I already got 34 articles published by major Taiwan newspapers. So I'm still following all these issues. And I also got invited to a lot of the seminars, discussions, talk shows, things like that. One of the very frequent questions posed to me is asked me to compare the U.S.-Taiwan relations between the current government of President Tsai and the previous government of President Ma. My answer always started from, not from the differences, but from similarities and the continuities, because I do believe there are very strong fundamentals in U.S.-Taiwan relations that will be continued, and that have been continued. Okay, let me start by telling you that, as you know, in Taiwan, the relationship with the United States has always been our most important foreign relationship. Its priority and further development always enjoys not only bipartisan but multi-partisan support. And for the American side, I'm glad to notice that the feeling is mutual in a way. I think you were here, you probably heard my good friend Jim Moriarty, the current AIT chair. He made a speech before CSIS last month. In that speech, and he described the U.S. relations with Taiwan. He called Taiwan a vital partner that the United States has built a comprehensive, I quote, a comprehensive, durable, and mutually beneficial relationship. Now, who has said that in the past? If you go look, I was here at that time, Susan Thornton. In May 2015, she made a speech before Brookings. If you remember that, that speech was in a way to expect a visit of a candidate Tsai Ing-wen. She used exactly the same words. Taiwan and the U.S. relationship is a comprehensive, durable, and mutually beneficial. So I'm so glad to see both in Taiwan and the United States, a lot of strong fundamentals will continue, and the rhetoric is still the same. But how about in practice? Now, in my opinion, the most practical thing the current president of the United States concerned about in U.S. relations with Taiwan is how many American jobs the U.S. relationship with Taiwan has created. Now, you know Mr. Terry Gou went to Wisconsin. That investment project would produce 3,000 American jobs, right? But how many American jobs being created by U.S. economic relations with Taiwan in total? Has anybody done any study in the past? No, but except for me and my colleagues. Before my departure, in May last year, let me show you, I still have the booklet here, but this needs to be updated. You know, based on the formula issued by the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is for every $1 billion of U.S. exports, about 5,300 American jobs will be created. Based on that, and then I, that time, circulate a direction to all our offices in the United States, asking all the offices, go to your area of responsibilities to see how many Taiwan companies there, to see how many American jobs are created or supported by those Taiwan companies. And we come up with a total, which is 323,456 American jobs are created or supported by U.S. economic relations with Taiwan as of May 2016. This is 100 times the size of Mr. Terry Gou's investment this time. So this is a very, very real strong fundamentals. And this trend, I think, will be continued. And I also have to say, this is probably an underestimate because it didn't include the service trade and didn't include arms sales. It didn't include small investments, such as investment into the restaurant business or motel businesses. So this strong economic ties will be continued. Another indicator is U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship. When I first got here, we were the 12th largest trading partner of the United States. This country is the largest trading country in the world. And you are trading with 224 countries and territories in the world. We, that time, as number 12. It's not too bad. But when I was here, we jumped one place every year. First, we overtook Saudi Arabia as number 11. Saudi Arabia is the largest oil exporting country. And then we overtook Brazil as number 10. Brazilian territory is 235 times larger than Taiwan, okay? And then we overtook India as number 9. I still remember when that figures were announced, I had the pleasure of having dinner with a bunch of congressmen, together with the then USTR, Ambassador Michael Froman. I told him, I said, that we just overtook India as the 9th largest trading partner of the United States. And he came back to me twice over that dinner. He said, are you sure about that? Because he was about to go to India together with President Obama, taking a group of 300 American businessmen to further develop American economic ties with India. So Taiwan is so big, even though it's a small, tiny, remote island, but this strong fundamentals will be continued for sure. And then let me also tell you, if we put in a comparative framework, mainland China's territory is 265 times the size of Taiwan. Its population is 58 times. Guess mainland China and Taiwan as a market for American goods. Of course, mainland China is much bigger. But how big mainland China is compared to Taiwan as a market for American goods? A lot of my American friends have said it must be 20, 30 times or 50 times. Some people even say 100 times. But let me tell you, last year, we bought $26 billion from the United States. Mainland China only did $112 billion. So mainland China as a market for American goods is only 4.5 times the size of Taiwan, even though their territorial size is 265 times and the population 58 times. That shows how big or how small Taiwan is. And that kind of strong fundamentals will be continued. Now, and let me tell you another figure, which is also very impressive, which is that even though we are your 9th or 10th largest trading partner, our last year two-way trade total is $65.4 billion US. But this number is even smaller than our trade surplus with mainland China. Our trade surplus with mainland China last year was $66.9 billion. Now, keep in mind, you are the largest trading power in the world, and you are trading with 229 countries and territories in the world. We are your 9th largest out of 24. But our two-way trade total, year after year, is still smaller than our trade surplus with mainland China. That's how big Taiwan is. So those fundamentals will be continued. Another fundamental, very strong fundamental will be continued is, I have to say, I commend our professional teams on both sides. You know, even though there's a lot of positions now still vacant and yet to be confirmed on the American side, but the American side has very good career diplomats, just like our team, just like my colleagues. You know, they did a very good job. I have to say, I can tell you for sure, without my good colleagues, the telephone call between President Tsai and President-elect Donald Trump would not have been possible. You wait until I publish my memoir, I can tell you more about that. Okay, but there's still a lot of differences. What are the major differences? Today, I think the number one difference is not between the two administrations in Taiwan. The number one difference is that if you talk about US-Taiwan relations today, inevitably, you have to bring into the cross-strait relationship into the picture. This is not just Taiwan, but the American side is saying the same thing. If you remember, if you were there with Jim Moriarty, my good friend, he said, actually that's the first sentence in his speech, I quote, he said, strong US-Taiwan relations and stable cross-strait relations are integral ingredients of and have significantly contributed to regional prosperity and stability, unquote. Both US-Taiwan relations and cross-strait relations. Now, here he sounded like Susan Sontag again, because in Susan Sontag's 2015 speech, I was still ambassador here. I read that speech many, many times. I can recite that almost word by word. There are three major points. The first point is that she said, the U.S. unofficial relations with Taiwan has never been better. It has never been better, meaning that since we changed our relationship in 1979, the relation under President Ma has never been better compared with the previous years. The second point, she said, one of the reasons why it's never been better, she said, an important ingredient, I quote, is the stable management of the cross-strait relations. Stable management of cross-strait relations. That's one of the important ingredients, quote unquote, of the good US-Taiwan relations. And the third point she made is that she wants to see that approach continue. Now, she said that actually to Tsai Ing-wen because candidate Tsai was coming for a visit early June, only 10 days after this speech was made. Now, so I would say President Tsai also tried to continue the approach. However, when she talked about the maintenance of status quo, there's one important ingredient is lacking, which is the 92 consensus, which, as you know, Beijing considers utmost, actually is the precondition to everything. So for that reason, today we see the cross-strait relationship. I think, not I would say that, a lot of people would agree, our cross-strait relationship has probably hit an all-time low. And people usually call it now as a cold confrontation with 3 no's. 3 no's meaning no communication, no buffer, and no mutual trust. And for today, we see that mainland China now using, I think the last panel already addressed that, diplomatic coercion, economic limitation, or even military intimidation against Taiwan. Now, what can Americans do? Did Americans try to help? I think Americans try to help, but Americans in a lot of ways could not make too much difference. You probably have heard American policy statement. Americans are always saying that we urge or we encourage the two sides to display flexibility, ingenuity, to resume the constructive dialogue. But this is not for Americans to decide. I can tell you that there have been so many cases recently that shows that even though Americans tried very hard to help, but at the end of the day didn't change the picture. For example, WHA. I know Americans were very sincere and started from the days when I was here. Americans not only try to help the issue themselves, Americans also try to line up like-minded countries to help. But at the end of the day, Taiwan still couldn't get in. Interpol, remember? While I was here, an Interpol resolution got passed by both houses of the Congress. On the House side, the vote tally was 392 to 0. It's a binding resolution. But at the end of the day, Taiwan still couldn't get in. Panama. A lot of my American expert friends in Taiwan, in a way, blame the Americans, saying, how come Americans didn't stop Panama from switching diplomatic recognition? And I said to them, this is impossible. Americans already recognized the People's Republic of China as early as 1979. How could the United States stop Panama? So, and then I think the last panel already addressed that the names of 5 Taiwan foreign missions been changed from either Republic of China or Taiwan into Taipei. Could Americans do anything? No. And the famous case, the political activist Li Wenzhe, I think his wife came here. Americans also tried to help, but Li Wenzhe already been detained for 145 days, I guess. I think Americans tried to help, but still didn't go too far. Okay, you know how many Taiwanese citizens involved in overseas electronic fraud cases in foreign countries, and then they've been repatriated, not back to Taiwan, but to mainland China for further investigation and even trial. Taiwan tried to get them back to Taiwan, but so far, we send our message, our request to mainland China, never been answered. So could Americans help? This is another major concern of ours. I think we talked to American friends, but at the end of the day, it still didn't make much difference. Now, last but not least, the PLA, military aircraft, they virtually encircling Taiwan airspace or flying very close to our ADIZ. In late July, I think it happened twice a week for 2 weeks. Did Americans say anything? Could Americans help? So I think this is the problem that we have to face today, even though the Americans, I think we have so many friends from Capitol Hill and the Foggy Bottom, State Department, everywhere. But Americans, you heard Jim Moriarty said, America has a widespread concern among American government agencies about this situation, about the lack of communication between two sides. Americans cannot come out to argue for either side or to throw a formula for both sides saying this can be an alternative to 92 consensus. Americans couldn't do that. You know about the 6 assurances. One of them, the Americans will not do mediation between the two sides. So given the circumstances, I have to say it's very hard for Taiwan to further develop this effective relationship with the United States. But the smart Taiwan diplomats always have some strategy to do, which is what I call an image building approach by asking our congressional friends to initiate a lot of pro-Taiwan resolutions. I sometimes get lost how many are there. Sometimes I think it gets a little complicated because you have to push things on both houses. Some things you probably just concentrate on one house and ignore, or on the other side, it probably gets slowed down. For example, I don't know why the WHA resolution, which was passed in 2004, now recently being revived, being passed at the East Asia Subcommittee of the House again. And I checked the language, I found that was probably when I was a DCM, I was deputy representative here. That time, my colleagues and I started that, and it got passed in 2004. That's something would require the State Department to make a report and to ask the American administration to help Taiwan get into WHA. But this is, I don't know why it was suddenly being revived in late July. It's probably too late. It's already too late for this year and too early for next year. So this is something like, port of calls. You already heard from Jim Moriarty. Jim Moriarty said port of calls can be a mistake, it can be very dangerous. So if I can still have a few more minutes, let me offer you my concluding remarks. I would say, given the current situation, and this today, my opinions are entirely my own, got nothing to do with my previous affiliation or my current affiliation. I would say the first thing is Taiwan should not always hope for American help regarding its own problem with mainland China, nor should it expect to take advantage of the bad moments in the US-PRC relationship, for two reasons. Number one, the US-PRC relationship is already very complicated and very changeable. Number two, a Taiwan highly reliant on American helping hand, but with very little real effect, is not in either side's long-term interest, because it will probably make the pragmatic American policymakers eventually lose their interest in helping Taiwan if still whatever the Americans do didn't make too much difference, especially when the American policymakers already have had so many problems with mainland China. So under that kind of situation, Taiwan has to try on its own to resolve or to diffuse its problem regarding 92 consensus with mainland China, and not to expect Americans to pour the chestnut out of fire for itself. Number three, I think Taiwan should distinguish itself as one of the largest single external sources of knowledge about and influence over mainland China, and share these assets with Americans to make the relationship mutually beneficial. Number four, I think more coordinated or more timely efforts are needed for pro-Taiwan congressional actions so as to make them suitable for administration to implement and will bring about real benefits for Taiwan. Here, I think I need to elaborate a little bit what I mean by that. As I said, now so many congressional resolutions, people sometimes get lost. For example, WHA. We have to worry about not just 8 days of WHA within a year. We have to worry about another 357 days. Now, when I was in Geneva, I already negotiated with the WHO authorities. Later, in spring 2009, we already have had an exchange of letters signed in which WHO already promised to give Taiwan CDC full access to WHO, professional health-related issues. And for example, we can have a direct communication to inform each other about some epidemic diseases. We can send our experts to technical meetings. We can nominate our experts to emergency committees of WHO. And we also solve the name problem because in that MOU or the exchange of letters, Taiwan CDC is called Health Authorities in Taipei, which is a very neutral name. Now, how many technical meetings Taiwan health experts can go to now? I think not too many. Let me tell you, today a lot of the WHO technical meetings, as you know, are funded by American money, by US Congress. So that's something we can cut in, rather than to revive an old 2004 resolution to repeat what's been said. This is what I call a more concerted, a more timely, a more effective congressional resolution is needed. Not just talking about Taiwan Security Act, Taiwan Travel Act. Let me ask you, even if the Taiwan Travel Act got passed, you think President Tsai Ing-wen can come here for a real visit? So this is why I think we need to have a more pragmatic approach. Now, number 5, Americans can positively show their support of Taiwan by not only words, but also by actions, such as sending senior US government officials, not the former officials, senior incumbent officials for business visit to Taiwan, and also send a large congressional delegations if Americans really want to show their support to Taiwan. In addition to congressional resolutions, I think this can be done as an effective image building measure. Last but not least, let's talk about, since we're going to have a panel on economic issues, I would suggest if we want to start the FTA process with the United States, the best way to start is probably the easiest chapter in the original TPP, which is e-commerce. I don't know whether you have seen the TPP file. TPP is already, altogether, is about 5,500 pages, being divided into 30 chapters. While I was here, we already talked to the Americans, starting from the easiest topic, which is e-commerce, because our two positions are close to each other. And later, we set up something called DEF, Digital Economy Forum. Every year, we have a conference, 1 year in Taipei, 1 year in Washington. So that's probably an easy starting point if we are pursuing, instead of TPP, a FTA with the United States. I think I better stop here. If you have questions or comments, I would more than happy to address them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. We have time for a couple of questions. Do we have any here in the back? Again, if you could please identify yourself and your institution.
Robert Chen from Houston, Texas. Ambassador Chen, I'd like to raise up some questions. The One China policy and the Taiwan relationship, to me, they conflict each other. So from your professional point of view, what kind of level different between them?
I think you have to go back to see the original language in the joint communique between the United States and the People's Republic of China about establishment of diplomatic relationship between them. The United States didn't say, the United States recognized that Taiwan is a part of People's Republic of China. The United States simply said, the United States acknowledges, not recognize. Diplomatically, these two words are very different. The United States acknowledges the Chinese position that there's only one China and Taiwan is part of China. Chinese position later, the State Department explained, saying that that means the Chinese position held by the Chinese people on both sides of Taiwan Strait is not just Beijing's position. So you read this, and then you look into the Taiwan Relations Act, you can find that, of course, you say this is, you twist the interpretation. But I think it still can make sense, because Americans didn't say recognize. Let me tell you, out of the 175 countries in the world which now have diplomatic ties with Beijing, you know how many in the diplomatic, the establishment of diplomatic ties in the joint communique, how many you recognize? Only 48 of them. It's only about 1/4 of them. A lot of countries like United States just acknowledge. Canadians use take note of. Japanese use understand and respect. The British use acknowledges. So I would say, if you put that in the overall picture, you cannot come up with a conclusion that this is a done deal because the United States didn't say that they recognize that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China. Thank God they didn't do that, because if they did that, they themselves would be in trouble. And it's very difficult for the PRC to implement that also. I can tell you when I was here about 15 years ago, when I was DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission. You remember those days, there were a lot of Taiwan fishing boats. They already lost their licenses because United Nations phased out the drift net fishing. So they became what? They became the transport ship for mainland Chinese stowaways. They took mainland Chinese stowaways first to Guam, and later to Hawaii, and later to American West Coast. Now, I remember there was 1 year, there were 14 cases. Of course, they've been captured by US Coast Guard, and these people need to be repatriated. Now, who is going to pay for the airfare, for the repatriation costs? I said to the American authorities, I said, okay, the Taiwan fishing boats, only a few crew or captain, first officer, only 5 of them, we pay for this 5. Another 150 million Chinese stowaways, they are the responsibilities of People's Republic of China's embassy, right? But the American authorities came back to me saying that they said they're not going to pay that. And I said to American friends, I said, if they recognize us as the sole legal government of China, we're going to pay for everyone. American friends never came back. Thank you. This is a true story.
So, question for one.
Can I have some water?
Oh, yes, absolutely, please. Oh,
This one. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. I'm Janice Chen from the DPP's U.S. mission, and really appreciate the perspective from the former Representative Shen, and especially that you highlighted that the U.S.-Taiwan relationship has a lot of continuity over time. And it's interesting that you were citing the recent speech by AIT Chairman Jim Moriarty about the U.S. views on, of course, their interests in cross-strait stability. And I think what's interesting is that at that same event, the former AIT Chairman Richard Bush asked him whether the United States is satisfied with the Tsai administration's efforts to reach out to Beijing. And Moriarty said that, we have seen that she's made certain efforts, and if you hear us expressing concerns about the lack of dialogue and also acknowledging that the Taiwan side has tried to reach out, you can draw your own conclusions from that. So I think Taiwan has always really appreciated the U.S. Sort of providing some consistency in its policy toward Taiwan and toward cross-strait across different administrations, whether here or in Taiwan. And that extends also to the U.S. Congress. The U.S.-Taiwan relationship is, of course, based on the TRA, so the Congress has a very important role to play in defining the terms of the relationship. But I do agree with you when you say that Taiwan needs to do more to help itself and to maintain the regionals and play a positive role in regional peace and stability. And one of the ways that the Tsai administration is trying to do that is to strengthen Taiwan's defense, is try to rebuild the morale of the military. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what would be, in your view, the next step in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship on the defense side and to increase Taiwan's security?
The next stage of U.S.-Taiwan relations in what field? In what?
Defense and security?
Defense and security. Well, I hope Americans can continue to one thing. Today, if you read Taiwan newspapers, you find Stephen Yet's name be mentioned a lot because he came out to say that if Taiwan declared independence, Americans would not come to help. Stephen Yet, as we all know, he used to work here, I guess. And to me, this is not a surprising thing to say. But I think all along American policy is that Americans want to avoid or prevent someday facing such a dilemma, whether they would have to come, really send their troops or send the aircraft carriers again to help defending Taiwan. I think what the Americans are doing all these days, all these years, is trying to not to face this kind of dilemma. So that kind of strategy, I think, is still there. That's something we appreciate that very much. But how you manage, how you operate that strategy very skillfully, it really requires a lot of diplomatic skills. But there's a very important ingredient, which is I think Taiwan has to do its own part. This is why I'm saying Taiwan has tried to at least, not to resolve, but to diffuse the current stalemate with mainland China. Otherwise, it's unfair to put all the responsibilities on the American side. As I said, even though Americans are very willing sometimes to help, but at the end of the day, it still couldn't make too much difference. Because one of the 6 assurances is America would not play mediation role. Americans all these years always saying that we urge you, we encourage you, but we're not going to get in to argue for either side or to offer any formula for the two sides to think about. I don't think Americans will go into that stage. I don't know. This is a very good question. I think we have so many experts here. This probably can do another panel on that.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Shen for an excellent presentation.
We are going to start the panel 2 pretty soon. And before we start the panel 2, I'd like to introduce our co-sponsor and TBAA, the president of WONG, and to say a few words for this event.
I'm sure this is not a wake-up call. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, President-elect, honorable guest, and distinguished speaker. On behalf of the Taiwan Benevolence Association of America, thank you, Heritage Foundation. Let us have this opportunity to be the co-sponsor of this forum. This forum, we hope through this forum will not only reinforce the relationship between the United States of America and the Republic of China, but also we can enhance the people of the two countries to understand each other, to build better relationship than ever. So this is my very short speech, and I thank you for your coming and thank you for your support. Enjoy this afternoon. Thank you.
And I also like to introduce another co-host, co-organizer in ITA's Institute of Taiwan and America Studies, President Wong. Now we're going to start the panel 2 and talking about economy issue. Okay, politics is interesting, but economy is fundamental, according to Dr. Shen. Everything is fundamental. So we're gonna go by the order on the program. So we're gonna start from Ryler Waters from the Heritage Foundation, and then next we're gonna have a Scar Kennedy from the CSIS, and then the final is Vincent Wong, Dr. Wong from the Ithaca College. Okay, Ryler, go first.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Well, as the representative for the Heritage Foundation up here today, I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about our Index of Economic Freedom and where Taiwan ranks among the 180 economies that are scored each year. For those who aren't familiar with it, the Index of Economic Freedom has been published by the Heritage Foundation every year for the past 23 years. Economies are scored on a 100-point scale, 0 being a completely repressed economy and 100 being the most free. For example, this ranges from North Korea with a score of 5 to Hong Kong with a score of about 90. While the score reflects each country's economic freedom, the score is based on an aggregate of 12 indicators that measure the rule of law, government size, regulatory efficiency, and market openness. In the most recent 2017 index, Taiwan scored a 76.5 points, placing it in the category of mostly free, and ranked 11th among all other economies. For some perspective, the U.S. only ranked 17th with a score of about 75 points. Both Taiwan's overall score for economic freedom and its global ranking in economic freedom have been increasing over the past several years, while the U.S. has been stagnant and even decreasing. Among other Asian countries, Taiwan ranks 5th, just behind Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, and Australia. Taiwan maintains good, strong property rights, limited government spending, and good business and trade freedoms, but also maintains weak labor freedom, judicial effectiveness, and weak investment and financial freedoms. So what does this mean? In short, the short answer is that Taiwan is doing a good job at maintaining economic freedom, but improvements can be made and should be made. On average, the more economically free a country is, the more prosperous its people will be. For example, whether you measure prosperity by the income per person, whether it's a measure of social progress or a measure of how innovation-friendly a country is. And historically, Taiwan's economy has thrived off its relatively open market policies. If we look at the wealth in Taiwan, not just gross national product, but total wealth in 2016, Taiwan totaled $3.2 trillion US. That's about a 50% increase from what it was in 2006, making it on par with countries like Switzerland and India. Purchasing power of Taiwanese is also about $10,000 more per capita than it was 10 years ago. Of course, there are now growing concerns about stagnant growth. This is perhaps where the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship becomes ever more important. I might not go into how Taiwan ranks as one of the U.S.'s largest trading partners, or even the size of the two individual economies. The U.S. and Taiwan have maintained strong economic relations for decades now, and it makes sense for this trend to continue, either for the sake of U.S. economic interests in the region, whatever those might be, or for the future of Taiwan's growth and economic independence from China. Of course, one of the easiest ways to solidify the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship would be through a free trade agreement. The current U.S. administration, of course, has highlighted its preference for bilateral economic negotiations over multilateral dialogues. And if the administration is as focused on the transactional outcomes from negotiations with its trading partners as we've heard, this pound-for-pound mentality, perhaps Taiwan has already proven itself to merit the launch of formal trade agreement negotiations. We at the Heritage Foundation actually have, in fact, been arguing for a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement for 30 years now. Back in the 80s, it was seen as a way to balance the large trade surplus Taiwan had with the U.S. It was also a means to leverage an opening of Japanese markets, as market barriers and state-owned enterprises in Japan limited foreign investment. Taiwanese officials, in an attempt to help appease concerns in Congress over the growing trade deficit, encouraged its own self-initiated Buy American practices. This included Taiwan adopting favorable measures for U.S. businesses, removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers, and outright purchases of U.S. agricultural and industrial products. Of course, if the past 40 years of strong economic relations aren't enough for current officials to merit a free trade agreement with Taiwan, then perhaps the last 13 years of dialogues and norms established through the U.S.-Taiwan Trade and Investment Framework Agreement may suffice. If that's not enough, and the administration is looking more near-term and transactional, certainly Taiwan's ability to open up its market to U.S. beef and pork imports may be one aspect to leverage in the opening rounds of a trade agreement. A U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement will be more than just a focus on tariffs, of course. Already, Taiwan's total average tariff rate is relatively low, at 6%. Non-agricultural tariffs average about 4%, while agricultural tariffs average about 16%. Taiwan scores relatively high on trade freedom at 86 points out of 100, but there are other issues that can be addressed through a trade agreement, including a continued establishment of norms regarding investment, regulatory, and market access transparency. And Taiwan has already made efforts to adhere to national norms, but Taiwan's labor and investment freedoms are still lacking, as labor freedom scores a 55 and investment freedom scores a 65 out of 100. There are often concerns by U.S. companies regarding the inconsistency of regulations, not to mention limitations on investment in certain sectors. The increase to a 60-day commenting period on new proposed regulations was definitely a step in the right direction. It's important to remember, though, that a free trade agreement aren't just means for increasing economic cooperation and establishing stable economic norms, but for the removal of government intervention from interfering with market forces. And it will take strong leadership on both sides to help push past both private and public interests that might not want a free trade agreement. Back in the 80s, it was Prime Minister Nakasone who took the initiative to push the privatization of Japanese state-owned enterprises past the bureaucrats, labor unions, and Diet members. To quote a former TECRO representative, Benjamin Liu, who was speaking at a heritage conference while he was the director of the economic division, back when TECRO was still known as CCNAA, back in 1987, and as he advocated for the launch of trade talks with the U.S., he said, "We are anxious to look into ways of protecting the U.S.-Taiwan trade relationship from the wide swings in political activity that are generated in both countries on an increasingly regular basis." I think both President Trump and President Tsai have what it takes to push past the political swings that exist today and expand the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationships if they themselves can commit to the economic partnership by signing a free trade agreement. In the meantime, of course, I'm enthusiastic about President Tsai's initiative to invest in South and Southeast Asia, as well as our smart city initiatives to make Taiwan into the Asia Silicon Valley. But it'll be difficult. Certainly, U.S. tech startups have enough difficulty of their own in our own Silicon Valley. Competition can be fierce, and uncertainty exists for all startups. It'll be important for President Tsai to help create an environment where investors not only want to invest their money, but an environment that allows for innovation to take place, even if those results are seen as disruptive. To conclude, I am optimistic about the future of U.S.-Taiwan bilateral economic relations, and I hope that the Taiwan administration can continue to find friends in the current administration and that we can continue to prosper together. Thank you.
Next is Scott. Scott now is serving as a director on the project on the Chinese business and political economy at CSI. Scott, please.
Sure. Well, I want to thank the Heritage Foundation and the other sponsors for putting on this event and for inviting me. And I wanted to use my time to talk about the ways that the U.S. and Taiwan can expand their economic cooperation. I don't hold a lot of optimism for the likelihood of a bilateral free trade agreement or a bilateral investment agreement, but I do think there are a lot of ways, practical ways, the two can expand economic cooperation. And so I want to, this is a glass three-quarters full story with that one element missing, but I don't think that's the entire story. So that's what I want to leave you with today. Let me elaborate in four points. The first is that, as Riley said, there are already extensive, deep economic ties between Taiwan and the United States. Trade, investment, people-to-people ties, the integration into supply chains as partners around the globe. And these ties are mutually beneficial, with very few losers on either side. The recent highlighting of Taiwan's trade surplus with the United States does not reflect, in my judgment, or the judgment of most economists, of who is winning or who losing or what is the score in the relationship. The trade surplus is the product not of protectionism, but of the arrangement of the global supply chain and the oddities of how one keeps track of trade. Geographically as opposed to by ownership. So this has been a strong relationship for some time, and it's been strong because there's, as I said, high mutual complementarity between the two economies. Both are WTO members. Both are signatories to the WTO's Information Technology Agreement, other plurilaterals. And so we already have a very strong relationship. I think the announcement of Foxconn's investment in Wisconsin is a natural outgrowth and sign of this, and I think we'll see more of these types of stories. The second point, both the U.S. and Taiwan have benefited from being part of global supply chains, and global supply chains that include China. In fact, Taiwan has benefited from the inclusion of China in global supply chains even more than the United States. Taiwan has offered an immense amount of technology, management skill, investment in China. And they also, of course, because of the common language, that has helped a great deal. There are around 1 million Taiwanese who live in China, which has helped further those ties and the benefits to Taiwan's economy. In addition, although both are WTO members, the cross-strait economic relationship is not entirely consistent with WTO practices that members keep towards each other, and instead is managed by ECFA. And as a result of that, Taiwan, unlike any other WTO member, has been able to maintain massive barriers to imports from the mainland. About a quarter of all tariff lines are banned for being imported from China. Lots of investment from China is also blocked, although not entirely. And so this type of ability to maintain those types of protections for Taiwan's economy has been something that no one else has had, and it's meant that the downsides have been of an economic relationship with China as part of global supply chains has been limited in Taiwan. I think the best statistic that shows that is we know that the proportion of labor in manufacturing in almost every major industrialized country has fallen dramatically over the last 20-some years. There's a single exception, and that's Taiwan. In 1993, Taiwan had 28% of its workers in manufacturing. Today, it has 27% of its workers in manufacturing. So essentially, no change. And so it's the way it has engaged China as part of these global supply chains has been distinctive and has left it in a relatively strong position. I want to make sure people understand that's a backward-looking statement. That doesn't it doesn't necessarily guarantee the future. All right, there's lots of challenges that everyone faces as a result of Chinese industrial policy, which is much more aggressive over the last several years under Xi Jinping, and much more challenging for everybody that is part of these global supply chains. Nevertheless, if you're just doing a historical analysis, it's been a big boon for Taiwan compared to just about everybody else. In terms of thinking about how the U.S. and Taiwan can expand cooperation, I think an FTA or a bilateral investment agreement would be nice, but of relatively limited benefit. And it would be politically very risky for Taiwan to take on. Of limited benefit because most of the benefits between the two economies are because they are in global supply chains. We count bilaterally, but it's the global supply chains that really bring the big benefits. And so unless you improve the global supply chains or regional supply chains, simply reducing barriers bilaterally isn't going to give you a big bang for the buck. And as Riley already said, Taiwan scores 76.5 and the U.S. 75. And I'm sure if you look at the bilateral arrangements with us, they're already really low barriers. So most of the easy stuff has already been picked off, and I think there are other things that we could do in the short term that would yield some positives for both economies, and particularly for Taiwan's economy. So I think the first thing that would be at the top of my list, this is the fourth point, the first thing that would be at the top of my list is both the United States, Taiwan and everybody else has to push back hard on Taiwan, on Chinese protectionism. That is the number one challenge everyone in the global economy faces, is China's efforts to expand and dominate into global supply chains where everybody else is. And so you can do that bilaterally, you can do it regionally. TPP was an important initiative to that. TPP 11, even without the U.S., without Taiwan in it, would be helpful in that regard. But that's job number one, is limiting the destructive consequences of China's movement into other parts of the supply chain through subsidizing its industries and forcing technology transfer. That's number one for everybody. The second, and Riley touched upon this, but not in much detail, Taiwan's the biggest foreign economic policy initiative of the Tsai government is the New Southbound Policy. And I was in Taiwan in June for a week doing research on it with two colleagues. We have a report coming out in the fall on it. And although it's just getting off the ground, the New Southbound Policy actually has the potential to be quite helpful to Taiwan's economy. It promotes expanding economic ties with countries in East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Some are more promising than others, but that's there's real meat on the bones in that. Expanding and helping to modify Taiwan's economic structure and expanding people-to-people ties, particularly in areas of education. Although the U.S. isn't one of the members of the New Southbound Policy countries, there are 18, the U.S. could do a lot to encourage all of those countries that are part of it to participate, to facilitate interactions. And that's because, again, these Taiwanese businesses moving more towards that region are part of global supply chains, and so it directly affects the interests of American companies as well. So I think there's a lot that the U.S. can do to help facilitate the effective implementation of the New Southbound Policy. Third, the other big regional initiative beyond the New Southbound Policy and TPP, which I've already mentioned, is China's Belt and Road Initiative. And there's although Taiwan, you wouldn't think that could be a dominant country in investing in infrastructure build-out, actually there's a lot of opportunities for companies from Taiwan to participate in the Belt and Road. And so the Belt and Road is a Chinese outward investment initiative, but there are a lot of opportunities for economies that are not part of AIIB, including the U.S. is not part of AIIB. And so I think there are potentially, because the price tag of the Belt and Road is so large, even getting a tiny sliver of Belt and Road investment would be helpful for Taiwan's economy. Fourth, this is the second to last point of what I think we can do. I think the United States, although a bilateral investment agreement or a free trade agreement with Taiwan is probably unlikely soon, there's still a lot that Taiwan can do to cover the last 13.5 points of the Freedom Index that would get Taiwan from where it is now to being tied with Hong Kong. And that gap is often framed and almost consistently framed as part of a bilateral negotiation between Taiwan and others. Well, and is seen as concessions. I think that 13.5 points are entirely in Taiwan's self-interest to make those changes in liberalization, which would help its economy. And regardless of whether the U.S. or anyone provides reciprocating concessions on the other side. And so I would just mention two areas. One would be in services, access to Taiwan services market, liberalizing those markets. The second would be an immigration policy. When we were to allow more worker immigrants into Taiwan's economy. When we were in Taiwan in June, and I think it's still going through the legislative yuan now, there was discussion over whether there ought to be a small modification of Taiwanese immigration law to increase the number of worker immigrants by several hundred, maybe up to 1,000. These are very small numbers. Taiwan needs tens of thousands of immigrants to move to Taiwan to work to contribute to its economy. We shouldn't be talking about hundreds or thousands, we should be talking tens of thousands. And so there needs to be a significant liberalization of Taiwanese immigration law, which is entirely in Taiwan's interest and shouldn't be seen as a concession to anybody else. Lastly, to turn the tables, the United States is at 75. And the U.S. isn't going in the right direction. And there's a lot that Taiwan and everyone else can do to encourage the U.S. to maintain or expand its markets and recommit itself to the multilateral trading system, to the WTO, to APEC, to the G20. That maintaining that open global multilateral system is critical to the health of the American economy, to the Taiwanese economy, to the bilateral relationship. And so I've tried to come up with what I think are 5 practical things that we can do. I can't say that they're all going to be adopted, but I would put my money on those things and my energy on those things and have less eggs in the basket of a bilateral investment agreement or a free trade agreement. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, final panelist, Dr. Vincent Wong, is serving as a Dean and Professor of the Politics School for Humanities and Sciences at Ithaca College.
Thank you. Thank you for Heritage Foundation, TBA, and ITAS for inviting me and for organizing this very important forum for elevating the American public's interest and awareness of important U.S.-Taiwan relationship. The big point I'm trying to make is why good economics also make good politics. And let me explain. In fact, that I'm trying to argue to make a strategic case for the 25% of the glass that's empty. I don't disagree that there are many ways of looking at U.S.-Taiwan economic partnerships. If you look at the 75%, you will say that it's historically been a very strong relationship, mutually beneficial. The U.S. is Taiwan's second largest trading partner. Taiwan, with a population of 23 million, is the 9th largest trading partner of the United States. The total two-way trade between the two economic partners in goods and services is about $85 billion of last year, of which $65 billion is in the goods. And in the goods trade, the U.S. has a deficit with Taiwan at $13 billion. But if you look at the services, which is another $20 billion two-way trade, the U.S. actually has a trade surplus of $4 billion. So if you look at this total picture, you will say mutually beneficial. And I agree with Scott that service liberalization may be one area that can further advance mutual benefit. And according to the U.S. Department of Commerce, U.S. exports of goods and services to Taiwan supported an estimated 8,000 jobs in 2015. This is the latest data available, and 130,000 supported by the goods exports, and 79,000 supported by the service exports. So the U.S.-Taiwan trade actually support a lot of U.S. jobs. And of course, with the Foxconn in Wisconsin and so on, I think that we'll support a few more. Of course, in trade, in goods alone, right now, about 10.3% of Taiwan's exports go to the United States, and 9.5% of Taiwan's imports come from the U.S. Of course, we know that as recently as 1985, about 40% of Taiwan's exports came to the United States. Now the picture has changed because 26% of Taiwan's exports go to China, and another 13% go to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is mostly entrepreneur trade, so you can add these two together, you say 40% of the Taiwan's exports go to China. So if I can use trade as a proxy of the bilateral relationship, then I will say that in the 1980s, the Taiwan was firmly in the U.S. camp from the geopolitical standpoint because you trade with allies. And of course, the U.S. was very instrumental and very helpful for Taiwan's economic development from the import industrialization to export-led industrialization, the diffusion of technology, the transfer of highly skilled talents, and so on. For Taiwan, the reversal of the roles between the U.S. and China in the last 30 years as the most important economic partner, represent China's economic ascendance regionally and globally, and America's relative declining economic influence to Asian nations. So this is a very important point because former President Obama reasserted the importance of pivot to Asia. And unfortunately, I think that when all is said and done, President Trump will rediscover the importance of Asia. But of course, one of the first things he did was to withdraw from the TPP, which, in my opinion, is a lost opportunity. But why do we still hear? So on the surface, the relationship seems pretty good. But why we continue hearing about squabbles over the last 25%? For example, in the 1980s, it was the Super 301, Section 301, namely that the U.S. takes unilateral government action to pry open the markets of major trading partners enjoying trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States. Now the U.S. Treasury Department puts Taiwan among 6 other major trading partners on the so-called enhanced analysis. So a trading partner is put on the enhanced analysis if they enjoy a significant bilateral trade surplus with the U.S., defined as over $20 billion. Taiwan does not fit this because it's about $9 billion. A material current account surplus that is at least 3% of GDP. Taiwan does fit this, and I'll come back to this point in a moment. And then persistent one-sided intervention occurs when net purchases of foreign currency are conducted repeatedly and total over 2% of the GDP. Taiwan does not fit this. So in other words, of the 3 criteria the Treasury scrutinized, Taiwan fits 1. But of course, Taiwan is not the only trading nation that has very high current account surpluses. In fact, I will argue, but of course, usually people say that if you have a very large current account surplus, that is, you are suspicious. They're suspicious that you have a very high trade surplus and that your currency is undervalued. So let's examine if this is true. I think that Taiwan has some extenuating circumstances. For example, Taiwan's fiscal policy historically has been very conservative. And Taiwan, believe it or not, has actually seen a rising external debt. As of last year, Taiwan's external debt was $159 billion, making Taiwan's foreign debt the 37th largest in the world. Taiwan, of course, is not a member of the International Monetary Fund, so it has no recourse to IMF funds and so on. So Taiwan's fiscal policy has been very, in other words, Taiwan is trying to save as much as possible. And of course, after democratization, the population in Taiwan wants distribution rather than saving. So all these contribute to a very large current account balance, but I think that gradually it will shift. Having said all this, and I will argue that it is very important to put the management of economic relations under a larger foreign policy and strategic lens. For example, US and Japan are very close allies, but in the 80s, all we heard is US-Japan was in a trade war, quote unquote. I mean, how can you allies be in wars and so on? Of course, it's a metaphor. And then, of course, now often all we hear about the US-Taiwan trade is that it's about beef. Of course, beef now is open. Now it's all about pork. But I think that this economic relationship has a lot more substance and strategic importance than simply pork or beef. I know that we are before dinner, but the larger point is that we need to conceptualize this economic relationship in broader strategic terms. In fact, I will argue that the US government may need to cut some slack for Taiwan. I agree that it is in everybody's benefit for Taiwan to become freer, to rise from 76.5 to 90. It's in Taiwan's self-interest to liberalize, to become a better candidate for regional integration or for multilateral trade. But consider this. I think that Taiwan is in a unique situation, and especially tough among America's trading partners. That even though China is the largest trading partner of many countries, but of all its trading partners, Taiwan is the one facing China's sovereignty claim and maybe security threat. And in fact, that China is also diplomatically strangulating Taiwan's participation in international economic realm. So Taiwan actually faced a triple whammy, what I will call. Taiwan joined the World Trade Organization in 2002, which would have been fantastic as an economic United Nations for Taiwan. Unfortunately, the next year, the Doha round collapsed, so Taiwan did not benefit from multilateralism. How about regionalism? Well, regionalism in Asia Pacific, the two most important movements currently are the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US led until the Trump administration, and the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which many said was led by China, but in fact, it was actually led by ASEAN. Taiwan is not part of that. So Taiwan is also facing pressure, facing difficulty, benefiting from regionalism. And how about bilateralism? Bilateralism, here we're talking about the possibility of signing a free trade agreement. I hear a lot of people talk about the pros and cons and the feasibility of US-Taiwan free trade agreement. But consider this. I think that the case for signing a FTA with Taiwan should not be ruled out on either economic ground or on security ground. Economically, one can argue that Taiwan presents a more attractive case than most of the trading partners that already have free trade agreement with the U.S., except maybe South Korea. For example, in the aftermath of 9/11, the United States signed FTAs with Jordan, Bahrain, Oman, Israel, and Colombia. I don't think any one of these will be economically more important than Taiwan. And in fact, that if Taiwan could be a member of the TPP 12 or 11, Taiwan would instantaneously become the 6th largest member in the TPP. So I think that on economic ground, obviously, and Scott is also right that when you have an FTA, you engage in very specific negotiations. So certain sectors of the U.S. will benefit, particularly the service areas. In fact, many years ago, both the Peterson Institute and the Government Account Officer, they estimated that there will be a small net benefits to the U.S. Now, on the security realm, I think that signing the FTA also makes sense because this will actually help overcome or offset some of the triple whammy I just talked about, the particular diplomatic isolation and security threat for Taiwan as a major economic player on the world stage, and that it will also possibly prevent the further gravitation of the Taiwanese economy toward mainland China. So think about this, that in the 80s, Taiwan's economy was oriented toward the east, which means the United States. And with China's opening to the outside world and economic ascendance, and in the 90s and the 2000s, the Taiwanese economy was oriented toward the west. But then with the election last year, the Taiwanese have actually noticed that too much economic dependence on China actually poses security threat. So now it's trying to orient toward the south, the new southbound policy. I agree that the new southbound policy has a lot of potential, but I think at the same time that the reorientation toward the east, namely the United States, should not be a rule out also. That's why I'm making a strategic case for strengthening U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship. Thank you.
Now we're going to open to the floor, and then we can take some questions before we close the event today.
No, if I could quickly make a point. I just kind of like a quick thing. I don't believe Taiwan should limit itself to just meeting 90 points in our index. It can strive much
100.
further. There's 10 more points above that, so food for thought.
Just for your reference, TBAA, the former TPP committee to promote Taiwan join the TPP, United States, in the past few years, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the excellent speech and discussion. John Wu from, I'm the former president of Taiwan Benevolent Association America. Quick questions about that. Earlier this year, that Trump withdrawn from, U.S. from TPP. Then the U.S. government is planning to participate the One Belt, One Road in the future, that which, or mainly is organized by China. So I believe, I agree with your point about the new southbound policy. It may not benefit Taiwan at all. And RCEP, they have the third sessional meetings in May, and they're going to sign in November, and Taiwan is excluded from that as well. So what Taiwan could do that not to be excluded from the world economy right now, because I understand the cross-strait relationship is a frozen degree. And what else Taiwan can do? Thank you.
You can take first.
Sure. Well, I think despite the diplomatic or political isolation, Taiwan's economy is on the heavily integrated in the global economy, and being part of WTO and the ITA and APEC have been extremely helpful. I think in talking with friends from Taiwan over the last several years about TPP, the concern was always, the top concern was always, when would Taiwan be able to join? I think now we've seen the real top concern is, will TPP ever come into existence? And in fact, the existence of TPP is more important to Taiwan than Taiwan being a member of TPP. And that's because TPP puts tremendous pressure on China to liberalize its economy. That's the number one biggest benefit from TPP, because China would lose its competitive advantages by not meeting the norms of TPP. Because TPP covers so many areas that were not covered by existing rules. And filling in those blanks are really important, particularly related to investment, state-owned enterprises, and e-commerce. So I think the number one goal is to figure out how to keep TPP alive, whether it's with the current 11, and then hopefully at some point down the road, the U.S. will regain interest. And then hopefully, maybe not in the next 3.5 years, but in 3 years and 7 months perhaps, and then maybe, and then creating an opportunity for Taiwan to join. So on RCEP, I wouldn't worry about RCEP. Even if it's signed and adapted, it is such a thin, superficial agreement that doesn't touch upon a lot of key areas that are important for Taiwan. I don't think Taiwan not being a member is going to have significant impact. I think I would focus more on what Taiwan can do through its new southbound policy and the other ways in which I think Taiwan can establish expanded ties with the United States. I would just say one thing about, to answer your question, but to also comment on something that Vincent said about China's economic gravity. And certainly that gravity is very large, and it's unusual that you have that depth of interaction with a strategic enemy, right? That's very rare. but I think there's no escaping that gravity. Not just for Taiwan, but for everybody. That is China's economy is a huge driver of global growth. So you have to figure out how to, so the strategic choice is to figure out not how to escape that gravity, but how to limit the risks from that gravity. How to make it so that the downsides of it in the near term and the short term are limited to some extent, but you can't entirely escape it. It's too big, too important, too large of opportunities. That's why so many Taiwanese companies are in China, how many American companies are in China. It's why everyone is, making deals with their soul on a whole bunch of issues because of the size of that economy. And so it puts everyone in a precarious position that we're rarely in. So I had to figure out how we limit the risks to that gravity, even though escaping it seems to be an impossibility.
So maybe I can pick up Scott's point. I agree. I think that if many U.S. trade allies, including the United States, face this problem of China's gravity and trying to manage this collective problem, then perhaps the U.S. It will be very helpful for the U.S. government to see that maintaining Taiwan's economic strength and independence is actually in the U.S. interest. I mean, actually bolster the U.S. position in the Asia Pacific. So that's just the point. I'm trying to make about the larger point of, I think sometimes the U.S. government, the U.S. International Trade Commission or USTR, they are doing their job by focusing on, say, sector openness, trade deficit, and liberalization, and so on. I think all this is great. But sometimes we focus too much on the trees and forget about the forest. I'm just trying to make a point about seeing the larger picture.
Sort of to look at the what to do, I think, aspect. Actually, sort of stepping that aside, I believe that the southbound policy and engagement, both with, or eastbound policy, they're both, they have merits in their own. But if we could foresee the future, we would all be millionaires. So if I could predict sort of the growth or decline in growth for Chinese economy and the impact that will have relative to the growth of South and Southeast Asian economies and what that will play for Taiwan, I would be a billionaire, however much you want to give me, that kind of thing. So as China's economy begins to slow in growth, while the Southeast Asian economies grow themselves, and if China sort of maintains this restriction on market access, political restrictions, or tie of political and economic considerations, while these new and emerging economies sort of find their own voice, it'll, in my opinion, I think they'll probably lean more toward Taiwan, who has shown themselves to be sort of like a beacon of growth in Asia for both free market principles and a democracy. Yeah.
So I'd like to just add one point on the new southbound policy. I think due to the geographical proximity and cultural closeness and so on, Taiwan should have done this a long time ago. And I wish this policy well. I hope that it will be implemented not in a very instrumental way. For example, if you ask most Taiwanese students what foreign language they would like to learn, the first choice would not be Vietnamese or Indonesian, right? And then, but if you look at the demographics, that there are many new immigrants in Taiwan, and and 1 in 4 children in Taiwan have a mother who is not Taiwanese, and so on. So the society is actually changing. So the point I'm making is that it should have been done a long time ago, and it's a very natural thing to do to know your neighbor better. Now, as to your question of what Taiwan can do, I think Taiwan should do everything. Taiwan should liberalize its economy, unilateralism, to make itself more attractive and maybe make more, on this pork issue, really engage the USTR on the scientific resolution on this. Taiwan should continue pursuing regional integration opportunities. In fact, in that regard, I think that sometimes there's a snowball effect. Taiwan should continue pursuing a free trade agreement with major trading partners such as U.S. And I think that if the U.S. is willing to do that, it will have a snowball effect. And Taiwan should continue to play a constructive role in several multilateral forums that it is a member of, such as APEC, WTO, and so on. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic about the economic future of Taiwan. It is, in a sense, very integrated in the world economy, despite its formal diplomatic isolation.
Oh, we can take the last question.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, the Toastmaster and the professors and the respected attendees. Before 10 years, I had worked in Taiwan electronic companies, ECS, Elite Computing System. And as well known, during the past 10 years, the IT brands like Huawei, maybe Xiaomi, they grew up in China market. But for most people, as me, that born in 1980s, in our memory, most Taiwan brands like maybe HTC, Acer, Asus, made in Taiwan is the guarantee of quality. Mm-hmm. And it's a very good memory, but we feel very disappointed that we cannot see many Taiwan brands and products day by day. So today, I really want to say, comparing with the brands in Japan or Korea, we still very prefer the Taiwan made it. Just as all of you may know, most mainland people go to Japan to buy the electric cooker. But we know, do you know the brand Datong? Yeah, Datong electric cookers can use more than 20 years. So today I have a question that how can we do to cooperate, to promote, to recover the blooming market of Taiwan brand? Thank you.
Any comment? Should be Dr. Wang. Yeah.
I think your question points to a very important but also difficult economic transition of the Taiwanese economy. How do you move from a economy that thrives on being a original equipment manufacturer, OEM, that basically you make the Apple, but Apple just put a shell on that machine and call it Apple, right? To branding, to become, to have your major brand and to reap more value added and so on. Taiwan has notable success in the information technology sector, but for more than 20 years, it has been searching for another sector. I don't think they have found it yet. In fact, that this reliance on a single sector is not optimal. So I think I don't have an answer to your question, but I agree with your observation. Maybe Scott can shed some light too.
Sure. I guess I would say that whether or not there are a lot of Taiwanese brands that are famous that are in stores or in your homes is probably not the number one concern that you ought to have. For the health of Taiwan's economy, being an OEM and being part of global supply chains has been very beneficial. There can only, with an economy the size of, with 23 million people, which is equivalent, that's the number of people that live in Shanghai. There are not a lot of global Shanghai brands. But having Acer and several of these others, I think is quite an achievement in and of itself. If I was looking, I know that the President Tsai has put forward several new industries to focus on, and for me, the life sciences and healthcare seem like a natural for Taiwan. And I think that's because of how excellent Taiwan's healthcare system is relative to the rest of the world. And so having such a high-quality healthcare system provides the opportunity to have a home market to test a lot of these things, and also having the engagement with China. You can do a lot of preclinical trials with Chinese companies, strong IP rights, although I guess they could be stronger. Of course, but there is going to be some amount of specialization that is hard to, I think economists talk about the Dutch disease. I think there might be a new term that eventually comes out called the Taiwan disease, which is about how does a country get so focused on a single sector, which drives growth for so long, but it's very difficult. You get entrenched interests in other areas, and it's very difficult to transition to other sectors or move up, which is a big challenge. But I think what Taiwan is doing is about as, I think if I was in their position, I think I'd be trying a lot of the same things. And I'm still a glass half full. It's still an economy that is essentially at full employment. It has a Gini coefficient, or a level of inequality, which is better than just about everybody, of under 0.3. The U.S. is almost at 0.5. There's many things that can be done, and I think that people are so worried in Taiwan, which is smart. It's always better to be more careful and looking toward the risks that you face. That's the smart thing to do. That's what I do at home with my kids every day. I tell them about all the risks they face and all the things that they shouldn't do. But sometimes you also have to realize that there's lots of opportunities and there are positives as well. So I hope that we take a balanced picture of where Taiwan's economy is and what the opportunities are.
Great. We have a super time management now. It's 5 o'clock. And I want to thank you before, we thank to our panelists. I want to thank to some friends, some guests have been staying for 2 panels until now. Thank you so much. And then let's have a big applause to our 3 distinguished panelists. And I like Kathy, don't go away. I want to thank you, Kathy from Heritage, a good partner to help us out to organize this event. And it's my honor to serve on this panel, and on behalf of TBA, GDC, and ITAS. And thank you so much for this stay with us on the Friday night. I wish you have a good weekend, nice weekend. So thank you very much.